My name is Rustlin, and I'm almost 60 years old, living in Brighton Beach here in Brooklyn. Now, I listen to your podcast a lot when I drive my cab, which is all I do, all day, every day pretty much, just driving my cab. But things never used to be this way. You see, I emigrated to the United States in 1992, a short while after my country disappeared overnight. But before that, I was a forest ranger in central Russia, where Europe meets Asia, in a place called Yugidva. Now, the Yugidva National Park is spread across the western slopes of Russia's Ural Mountains, which was about 1,600 kilometers east of Moscow. Now, there is a tundra at the highest elevations, while meadows cover the lower, but more than half of the park is covered in boreal forest of pine and spruce. At almost 19,000 square kilometers, it is a very big place. And to put that into perspective for you, the entire landmass of Kuwait is only 17,000 square kilometers, meaning the park is even bigger than some entire countries. Seeing as it's in quite a remote location, there are other parks with much easier reach of Moscow and St. Petersburg. The park received relatively low levels of tourism, with only a few thousand people visiting each year. Seeing as it's in quite a remote location, there are other parks with much easier reach of Moscow and St. Petersburg, and the park received relatively low levels of tourism, with only a few thousand people visiting each year. Now, back when I worked there, those visitors were often the families of Red Army soldiers stationed at nearby bases, as it was an encounter with one such soldier in 1987 that marked the beginning of the events that I'm about to share with you. My official title while working for the park was Lishnik, which loosely translates to forester. Now, we don't have rangers, and I find this a very American concept. We were not offered fancy titles under socialism, and we did not require them to do our jobs. We were foresters, one and all, and that's what I responded to when I heard it barked at me from down a trail one day. It was high summer, the busiest time of the year in terms of tourism, and I was walking along a woodland trail when I suddenly heard someone shouting from behind me, "You there, Forrester, come here now." Now, in that moment, I turned to see a man out of uniform, but I could tell just from the way he addressed me that he was an officer in the Red Army. I had served a few years in the Army myself when I was a much younger man, enough to know its officers shared the same collective personality, that which my American neighbors called jerk-offs. I like this word, and it almost sounds like a Russian word. And as he marched towards me, quick and angry, I turned to face him. Now, behind him stood his family, a wife and two young children, a boy and a girl. But unlike the officer, who appeared furious, all three of his family looked very shaken, like they had seen something which frightened them deeply. Now, when I asked the officer what the problem was, he exploded. He told me some strange person was wandering around the forest, and that this man had deliberately set about to intimidate his wife and children as they sat down for a picnic. I asked for a description of the man, and the officer described him as being tall, dressed in dark furs, and wearing a hat that appeared to have been made from a bear's head. Now, at first, he didn't outwardly threaten the family. He just simply watched them from a distance and opted for a silent staring contest when challenged by the officer. But then, when the officer took a few steps in his direction, the man wearing the bear's head began to charge at them. The officer said his children began to scream, and he believed he was going to have to fight the man to protect them. Yet just in the style of the beast which sat atop his head, it was a false charge, and after having scared the officer's wife so terribly that she was crying, he stopped and then walked off laughing at the terror he'd sown. Now, to me, it sounded like a hunter who drunk too much vodka, but when I suggested that, the officer made it clear that the man was no hunter. He carried no visible weapon. All he had was madness in his eyes. Now, he also suggested that I find him and fast, because if the man wasn't apprehended by the end of the following week, there'd be hell to pay. So later that day, myself and one of my fellow foresters got to work trying to find the so-called crazy man who wore a bear's head for a hat. Now, we had an old UAZ 469 back at central headquarters, one which we nicknamed the Goat, It was loud, the brakes were lousy, and riding in it for long distances put bruises on your butt. So, not necessarily the greatest of all time, like my friend's kid says about the Dagestani fighter. The goat wasn't gentle, but it was reliable, and it was easy to repair. And then with so much ground to cover to do our jobs, we loved it like the Huns loved their horses. We drove out to where the officer had spotted the man wearing the bear's head, and then we went walking around the woods for hours, looking for tracks or leftovers from campfires or animal butchery. Now, the park used to get a great deal of illegal hunting, especially during the autumn months, which certain poorer families wanted to stock up their larders for the long Russian winters that I do not miss. And since the park was so big, these hunters sometimes spent days at a time living off the land while tracking down larger animals to bring home. All that activity makes them easy to track. But to our surprise, and aside from a few useless tracks that led into streams or onto hard ground, there was no sign of the bear man anywhere. Now, we decided to finish our search as sunset was fast approaching, but since I most definitely believed the officer when he said he'd bring trouble for us if we didn't find him, we just resumed our search for the bear man the next morning, bright and early at dawn. Now, myself and a coworker headed further into the wilderness, leading on from what we believed were likely to be the bear man's tracks, but we couldn't know for certain. We crossed a few miles of meadows and streams, keeping our eyes on the ground for any sign of our bear man, but all we found were animal tracks, a few droppings, but nothing human. The man had no doubt gone deeper into the park, in which case we were traveling in the right direction, so to not find a single sign of him beyond what we'd already found was deeply unsettling. And after a while, myself and my partner started to believe that going any further was a waste of time. If we hadn't found any trace of the man, then we were in the wrong area. But then, right as we were about to turn back and return the goat to HQ, we found the charms. Now, I don't know if charms is the right word here, but the word in Russian is obereg, and it means like trinkets that have a holy or spiritual power to them. Some are related to the church and consists of lengths of blessed rope that some tie around the necks of their dogs, but others are related to Zagavori, or Slavic folk conjuring, and do not bring blessings, but only curses. And so, as you can imagine, it was a very unpleasant surprise to find that the ones we discovered that day were almost certainly of the second variety. The first one we found was hanging from a low branch and consisted of a small bird's skull with a backboard of woven twigs. Now, my partner pulled it from the tree and gave me a look. Such things were not strictly legal during communism. Zagavori wasn't against the law, but a man could expect some extensive psychiatric treatment, quote-unquote, if he was found to have faith in such ancient superstitions. We didn't take this as an indication that our bear man was a crazy person worshipping the old gods, but we certainly took it as a sign that he wasn't interested in respecting our authority as foresters. Now, having realized that we were closer than we first thought, we decided to push on into the forest. Then only after a short distance, we found more of what we could only assume was the bear man's charms. Not all of them included animal bones, only the most disturbing ones. But each and every one let us know that we were in this man's territory, some place he did not want us to be. There was still the question of if this man actually made the charms, but we had to assume it was him because the idea of 2 or more people running around with furs while making charms, that was just too unsettling for us to consider just yet. And since we had his territory roughly marked out, myself and my partner returned to HQ to report what we'd found. Now, our boss told us that he'd organize a wider search with a larger team for the next morning. And at dawn, we hiked alone to cover more ground, using radios to keep in touch with each other. But this proved to be a big mistake. At around mid-morning, one of our team was walking through the area that we'd explored the day before when suddenly, the very ground beneath his feet seemed to give way. At a pure instinct, the forester turned as he fell and tried as best as he could to propel himself away from the drop. This meant that he was able to hang on, but only barely before he used all of his might to drag himself to safety. Now, once he'd managed to find his feet, he turned around to inspect what he'd almost fallen into. And that's when he discovered a deep pit full of sharpened stakes. And there were 6 in total, and each was sharp enough to puncture a man's boot, should he have fallen with enough force. And since he was safe to do so, the team member called in what he'd found over his radio, and we all went rushing over to his position to check it out. And only then did we realize how serious the situation was. This bear man didn't simply mean to mark out his forest fiefdom. He was determined to wound or potentially even kill anyone who pursued him. And since we were not armed at the time, we retreated to our various HQs, either northern, central, or southern, and awaited further orders from our boss. Now, we were itching to find the man and have the police arrest him for almost snuffing out one of our team. And then when the time finally came to strike back, it came with fantastic news. The next time we went out looking for the bear man, we were told that we'd be equipped with rifles loaned from the local Red Army militia, like your Army Reserves kind of thing. And we were also ordered to travel in teams of 2 for safety, which was also music to our ears. And we thought this could keep us safe and that the sight of us with weapons might scare this bear man away, but we were wrong. Dead wrong. And just a few hours into the search, we received a frantic call over our radios from one of the 2-man teams. The caller sounded terrified as he explained that they were under attack from an unknown position. They couldn't see the attacker, but their attacker could see them, meaning they'd been forced to fall back at a rapid pace to avoid being hurt or killed. Now, we hadn't heard any gunfire, which was obviously very strange if these 2 men were under fire, but we also knew which sector the pair had been assigned, so we went running in their direction with our rifles ready. Now, we expected to hear gunfire on our approach, but we didn't. We only heard the sound of our 2 frightened coworkers running for their lives and yelling for us to help them. When they saw us, they began shouting about how he was behind them, and then they frantically began urging us to rake the area behind them with bullets because he was there, we just couldn't see him. They had clearly not been spooked by anything imaginary. Someone had most definitely given them a fight, but to us, it looked like they were running from ghosts. Now, the 2 men refused to come out of cover for a minute or two, saying that there had been arrows flying at us any second. Now, this is the point where we all asked them, "Arrows? Are you sure?" But we didn't need to take their word for it because after carefully retracing their steps, we found one of the arrows that had been shot at them buried in the trunk of a tree. Now, that incident with the arrows marked the end of our forester patrols. The boss refused to allow us to return to that area of the forest without a militia escort, the militia being the Soviet militarized police force here. They could bring their Kalashnikov and PKM machine guns with them, all fully automatic, unlike the SK rifles we used, which dated back to the Great Patriotic War. And a week later, and once they had assembled, we guided the 24-strong militia unit towards the bear man's territory, and then we hiked up and down the forest all day long in search of him. Seeing as we were a larger force, we were able to cover much more ground, but no arrows or bullets were fired, and we failed to discover the man's living arrangements. We thought that, since we didn't encounter him a second time, the bear man had most probably moved on, and this made a lot of sense to us as he'd seen us walking through his woods with rifles just a week or so prior. If the man really was confined to a simple bow and arrow, then we had him sorely outgunned, and it only made sense for him to flee while he still had his luck. But the man had not moved on. On the contrary, he simply waited to strike on his own terms. About a week after the militia helped us sweep the forest, 2 foresters staying in a northern sector cabin received a very frightening surprise in the middle of the night when they discovered that someone had snuck up to their cabin and set it on fire. Luckily, one of the foresters was awake and heard the glass bottle smash on the wood outside before the sudden burst of flames sent him rushing for the fire extinguisher. He tried his very best to douse the flames, but those old Soviet military fire extinguishers that we had were next to useless, and he was unable to put out the fire. Both foresters managed to escape the burning cabin with their lives, but the incident marked a further escalation in this conflict. Instead of us going hunting for him, This bear man was now hunting us. And the boss had called the militia back into the forest, only that time they arrived with more than twice the numbers. Instead of just 24 men, they sent an entire company of militarized police to comb the bear man's territory, and that time, he didn't simply watch and wait for the policemen to corner him. He attacked. Chaos erupted around midday when one of the militia officers was shot with an arrow. Thankfully, it only punched through the meat of his shoulder and did not penetrate any internal organs. But we all heard the man's screams of agony echoing around the forest before a storm of gunfire commenced. The men accompanying the wounded officer opened fire into the woods, shooting everywhere and anywhere in the hopes of hitting their hidden attacker. When they finished, no more arrows came after their storm of gunfire, and following a search of the area, blood trails were found leading deeper into the forest. The militia tracked these blood trails with dogs, and after hours of marching deep into the woods, they finally found one of the man's living spaces, consisting of little more than a dugout that used pine branches for shelter. The blood trails had ceased long before then, presumably after the bear man tended to his wounds, but despite there being ample evidence of him residing there, he was nowhere to be found around his improvised living space. Now, that final militia patrol marked the end of our encounters with the bear man. There were no more arrows fired, no more charms found, not for a long time anyway. We thought the man had either succumbed to his wounds or decided to vacate the area entirely. And either way, we had dealt with a problem that could have easily resulted in one of us losing their lives. And so, as you can imagine, we were very relieved to be able to focus on our jobs again. Now, at this point, years have passed, and the Iron Curtain fell. And overnight we found that we didn't have jobs to even do anymore. Some had stuck around living off the land and off what little our old money could buy us. But then slowly and surely, one by one, foresters started leaving. Some for Moscow or Perm to find work, and others to foreign countries where they'd hoped to start a new life. I ended up being one of those men who left Russia for good, but during that process of getting a visa, packing up my things, and saying goodbye to family, I often wondered if I was doing the right thing or not. But do you know what happened to make me realize that I was doing the right thing? It was when I heard from an old coworker, still living in and working in Yugoslavia, that on a routine tree count, another one of the bear man's charms had been found. Only this one looked brand new. And I've never looked back, not because I don't miss Russia, which I do a lot sometimes. It's because there was never just one wild man wearing his bear's head, hoping to kill or wound foresters. There were more, perhaps even a lot more. And it felt like it was only a matter of time before that same bloody struggle played out, all over again. My name is Ion, and I'm a forester here in Romania. I lived in a small village very close to the forest, and every morning after waking up early, I put on my uniform and I head out into the forest. And my job is really quite simple. Just like my colleagues, I walk many kilometers every day to check the trees. We mark old or sick ones to be cut legally, and then we count the number of young trees and plant new ones in the spring. Now, we keep our eyes peeled for bears and wolves or lynx, because they too must be monitored and counted just like the trees. But one of our most common activities is stopping cars and trucks to check their papers and check for illegal wood. Because without a doubt, the single biggest problem that we have here is illegal logging. Now, they mostly come at night with axes and chainsaws, and then cut down the best and oldest trees, either beech, oak, or spruce, and then haul them away as fast as they can. Now, you might ask yourself, well, how many trees can these people cut down? It can't be many. Well, sometimes the larger gangs can cut down to 100 trees per night, and they do this night after night, taking very few nights off, so in that space of about a month, we can lose thousands upon thousands of healthy, old-growth trees. Now, many of the foresters, the less reputable ones, take bribes from the loggers. The rest of us are intimidated with their axe and chainsaws, and sometimes they even carry guns, something we ourselves were not allowed to carry until 2019, at which point it was too late to stop this story's events from unfolding. Illegal logging is very damaging to the forest, and not just in the ways that you might assume. Without the trees, the soil washes away when it rains. This muddies rivers, causes them to burst their banks, and they flood villages to cause devastating and sometimes lasting damage to people's lives. Logging also frightens the animals, who either flee their habitats or are killed as their nests or dens come crashing down, or are crushed by those same falling trees. And I fear that if we lose our beautiful places, my children will not get to see the big old forest that I saw when I was young. And that thought breaks my heart, but it also gives us the will to fight them. And it's just that. This fight has required many sacrifices, not just in time and effort, but in blood. And for a long time, we used to hide in the forest at night with a notebook and a flashlight. If the group of illegal loggers was large enough, we would simply hide in the darkness, take notes on their numbers. However, if the group is small enough, we can sometimes trick them into thinking that we are more in numbers, at which point they will abandon their lumber, jump into their trucks, and drive away. But this isn't always the case. Sometimes the loggers go on the attack and will rush us with their chainsaws and axes at the ready. And believe me, you have not seen your life flash before your eyes like you will when a man with a revving chainsaw is running at you full speed. It's a horror that I'm never likely to forget. Now, we call the police when this happens, but they are stationed far from the forest and only ever arrive too late to do anything about the loggers. Now, for the most part, us foresters tried our best to stop the logging, and we also tried to root out those of us who have been taking bribes. We tried very hard, but we were mostly unsuccessful in this. And in the end, the government decided to tar us all with the same brush. So one day our boss summoned us all to the headquarters because he'd had an announcement to make. The local government had gotten sick of us failing to adequately deal with the problems of the loggers, and after learning of a few isolated cases of foresters taking bribes, they decided that we all had been corrupt. Our protests fell on deaf ears as the government had already decided what they were going to do. If we weren't going to root out those taking bribes, then we would all have to pay for the lost lumber. Thousands of liu, our national currency, would be taken from our collective paychecks every single week, and the longer we failed to deal with the problem, the longer the deductions would continue. We were furious, absolutely furious, but this was also at a time when we had but two options to choose from: work as agreed and lose out on pay, or quit and face the possibility of not being able to put food on our families' tables. And for some of the younger foresters, it was a tough choice. But for those of us with families, we had only one option: ramp up our efforts to rid the forest of those loggers, no matter what the physical or spiritual cost. And at this stage, we were still not permitted to carry guns around the park, so we had to think creatively to scare off the loggers. And at first we used firecrackers, very large and powerful ones that we could launch through the trees from a distance. These would explode over the loggers' heads and terrified them when they were working in the darkness. But then after a while, they learned not to be bothered by them and would just carry on until we ran out of fireworks to launch. And after that, we tried bringing dogs to scare the loggers, but they called our bluff as we weren't willing to risk the safety of our loyal furried friends, so we didn't sick them on the loggers anymore. And all the while, we petitioned the government to allow us to carry guns with which to defend ourselves, but at each turn, we were told the same thing over and over: you're not soldiers, you're not police, and it's too dangerous. In the end, we were told to focus on intel gathering in the hopes that we would turn over what we found to the police and have them arrest the loggers in their homes. But this was a very slow process, and as we began to lose money, we began taking risks. For months, we found ourselves fighting a losing battle, and then finally a small victory gave us a massive boost of morale. Two of the foresters, Niku and Gavril, were out on patrol one night when they found a group of loggers. There were a lot of them and only two of our foresters, but then instead of simply observing them and taking notes, Niku and Gavril hatched a plan. And this was at a time when if one lone forester confronted the loggers, the loggers would just simply chase them away with their axes and chainsaws. And so when Niku began shouting at them and walking straight over to them with his flashlight switched on, some of the loggers stopped their cutting and began walking towards him. And there was shouting of all kinds of curses, making a big scene, and although not all of the loggers went to chase Niku away, it caused enough of a scene to draw the attention of those who remained behind. Meaning no one saw Gavel sneak up to their truck and stab holes in 3 of its 4 tires. No one saw him sneaking up, and no one saw him sneaking away. And then the next morning, a second pair of foresters found the illegal logger's truck abandoned with those 3 flat tires. We were elated, and we celebrated the abandoned truck like we had just won a battle in some great war. We were able to sell the illegally harvested lumber to recoup the forest's losses and plant many new trees, and we also had a new and effective way of fighting the loggers, and that brought our spirits up an incredible amount. But sadly, it didn't even last a month, because just a few weeks later, little Pavel was out patrolling on his own in a section of forest that we didn't think was of any interest to the loggers, and we found out that we were wrong. It was the middle of the night when we got a call from Pavel saying that the loggers were trying to outsmart us by logging where we didn't expect them to. He said there were lots of them too, 2 trucks worth, so he needed backup to try and scare them off or distract them enough to get a knife into the truck's tires. Those of us that were on duty and could access a vehicle rushed to Pavel's aid. We were hopeful, knowing that we could stop those loggers if we could only get a man near the trucks. But then as we all rushed to Pavel's position, he started talking over his radio again. He said the trucks had almost finished loading up and that the loggers were preparing to leave. We told him not to do anything alone, but after that, he stopped responding on his radio. I panicked, and so did everyone else who heard the radio so quiet. Then, when I arrived at the scene, only my fellow foresters were present and the loggers had disappeared entirely. But to our worry, so had Pavel. And we spent the rest of the night searching for him, walking in pairs with our flashlights and calling out his name. We searched for miles around, but when daylight finally came, he turned out to be no more than 100 yards from where we were first standing. We all knew that he had been found, and we all knew the search had come to an end, because we heard a man screaming like his sanity was slipping away. He had found Pavel, and they had chopped and sawed him to pieces. It was without a doubt the worst crime I had ever had the misfortune of laying eyes on, and in my time as a forester, I had seen a number of very grisly murders and very gory accidents, but not one of them, not even the prostitute who was found broken in half and shoved into the cavity of a tree, managed to horrify me as much as seeing Pavel in pieces. It affected everyone terribly, and many of us went to Pavel's funeral to console his mother with how brave he'd been. I wouldn't say his sacrifice was worth it, because we should have been given weapons long before Pavel lost his life, but his death prompted our bosses to enter into serious talks with local politicians who relented and allowed us to carry rifles. We're not allowed to open fire unless we're directly threatened, but seeing us with rifles was all it took to scare the loggers into going someplace else. We put a brass plaque up at the HQ to honor Pavel's sacrifice, and it's a reminder to new foresters that they are lucky to be a part of a new generation who are allowed to defend themselves. We still face danger, and illegal logging hasn't stopped entirely, but now, no one will ever suffer the same fate as poor Pavel, who died while protecting the forest from human greed. I've worked for the Forest Service for the past 15 years or so, and it's a job that comes with a set of pretty unique challenges in terms of law enforcement. And one of the biggest problems we face is that of illegal hunting. No matter how flexible we are, and no matter how much prior warning we give the local hunting community, there are still those who seek to bypass the law in order to bag themselves a buck at a season. It's probably one of the most infuriating things we deal with too, because if everyone acted like the out-of-season hunters, there'd be far fewer deer and other animals to hunt in season, and it might well contribute to a population spiral among the local fauna. And they acted like the rules shouldn't apply to them, and they give you the worst excuses. Like one guy swore on all he held dear that he thought it was still September. I mean, he'd have to be a moron to forget what month it was, and he'd have to have pegged me for even more of an idiot to believe an excuse like that. Needless to say, we take illegal hunting very seriously. So when we get reports that they're operating out there, putting the animal population in danger, you can bet your bottom dollar that we act on them. So one day, when I got word that some illegal hunting might have been taking place in a particular area of the forest, I drove over immediately to check it out. Now, one of the techniques we use to identify illegal hunting is examining tree trunks in the suspect area. Now, be it a fresh scar in the bark, a small puncture buried beneath new growth, or the piece of metal detected just under the surface, there are many ways to tell if a rifle or shotgun had recently been fired in a certain location. A bullet lodged at a certain height can tell investigators not only where a hunter stood when taking a shot, but also the direction the shot was fired, and we can also use the frequency of said damage to determine if it's a place poachers use as a regular spot. If the trajectory of the shot lines up with the habitat of a protected species, it might even help officers build a case involving the killing of said protected species. And in light of that, us rangers sometimes use metal detectors to locate lead or steel hidden beneath the tree's bark, or, in serious cases, bullets may be removed for ballistic testing. A cartridge dug out of a tree can link a crime scene to a specific firearm just as it might in traditional criminal investigation. Logging companies also have a large vested interest in this because when their saws hit metal buried in wood, the blades can be ruined and operators can be severely wounded, sometimes even killed. In fact, a lot of the reports that we get come from sawmills, who alert the authorities to places where gunfire into trees happens frequently. In this way, trees can serve as a sort of silent witness. Long after an illegal shot had been fired, the evidence may still be lodged there, right inside the wood. So, after getting the report and driving over to the area in question, I grabbed a handheld metal detector from my truck and then went walking through the trees looking for any sign of gunshot damage. Sometimes buckshot damage looks like scratching from deer antlers, which they do remove velvet and mark territory, so sometimes you'll run the detector over a suspected patch of bark only to get nothing. But then after walking for maybe half a mile, I saw some pretty glaring evidence of shotgun damage to a tree. Now, it was a clear example of buckshot damage, one of the clearest I'd ever seen, so I had no doubt whatsoever what had caused the damage. But when I ran the detector over the stop, it just stayed silent. This was obviously very confusing because even the smartest illegal hunter doesn't bother to go digging into tree trunks to retrieve tiny pieces of metal, and from what I could tell from the naked eye, there was a lot of it stuck in that tree. So much so that it might have even come from multiple shots. I pulled out the small knife that I carry with me at times and then started to carefully pull away some of the bark around the affected area. Now, once again, it was quite clearly some ballistic damage because of the obvious tunneling, but when I got to the bottom of one tunnel, it wasn't a fragment of dull metal that I saw, but a kind of off-white, almost porcelain-looking substance. I'd never seen anything like it in my life, and I've been working for the Forest Service for almost 10 years by that point, so naturally, I was very focused to get to the bottom of it. I used my knife to scrape away some of the wood so I could dislodge the small off-white clump, but then after very carefully extracting it from the tree and examining it up close, I was so shocked that I remember letting out a gasp as I almost dropped it. It wasn't a piece of buckshot. It wasn't a bullet. It was a tooth, and from what I could tell, it was a human tooth. As a ranger, you learn to identify the teeth and/or bones of all the various animals that call the park home. Birds are probably the easiest to identify, and then deer teeth are pretty easy seeing as how flat they are. And the same applies to carnivore teeth too, as their distinct shape makes them very easy to identify. And so when I pulled what was quite clearly a front tooth out of that tree, there was no doubt in my mind that it was holding a person's tooth, and not an animal's. Now, we might be forest rangers, but we're still law enforcement, and we're charged with all of the same duties as regular police officers. So when I found that tooth, my first thought following the initial shock was, I need to preserve the rest of the evidence. I walked back to my truck, called in what I'd found over the radio, and then made my way back to the damaged tree to string a bunch of crime scene tape around the surrounding undamaged trees. One of my coworkers was on scene within the hour, and when I showed them what I'd found, they also admitted to finding it incredibly scary. We also felt kind of powerless because I'd say 90% of stuff that goes on in the forest stays in-house, so to speak, as in we deal with it ourselves. But something as bizarre and unexpected as teeth being buried in a tree would require a team of crime scene technicians, possibly even a forensic anthropologist, since we didn't even know how old they were and how long they'd been stuck in that tree. Now, it took days before a full team was assembled. But then one morning, right at the break of dawn, a whole team of techs and forensic guys and a photographer were all headed towards the taped-up area. Everything was photographed. The tree, the ground around it, and positioning of the damage, as well as a close-up to show the teeth still lodged in the trunk. Only when all that was done did they actually go about removing the rest of the teeth from the tree, and they only did so using tools meant to preserve even the smallest trace of DNA or residue. The team also took samples of the wood too, because the rate of growth can help determine how long the teeth have been there. My coworker and I stood there watching them all morning and then offering any information that they might find useful. The investigators seemed particularly interested in there being any unusual activity in recent weeks, and we said if there had been any, we sure hadn't spotted it. And then after that, it was up to the lab to do their tests, so all we could do was wait patiently to hear back. Obviously, our number one question involved who the teeth belonged to, and so did the lab. And so the very first thing we did was compare them to the dental records of those on the National Missing Persons Registry. Now, unfortunately, they didn't get a match, but they were able to quickly move on to DNA testing, which everyone believed would be more likely to bring up a match. DNA testing doesn't just tell you who something belongs to, it tells who their relatives are too. So even if the lab didn't get a direct match, there was a chance that we'd be able to contact who could fill us in on the whole picture. But there were no matches, none whatsoever. Whoever's teeth were in that tree had no relatives on that system, living or dead. And while that's not entirely out of the question, it was another deeply unsettling little detail that we had to contend with. In the end, we never did find out exactly how those teeth ended up in that tree. All we got were just a list of likely theories. One that's worth mentioning, although it turned out to be false, was the idea one of my coworkers had. He figured that it might be some kind of Native American burial site, so old that a tree actually grew up and brought some of this guy's teeth with it. Now, I mean, there was obviously a chance of foul play and that some poor soul had taken a shotgun blast at close range or something, but if that was the case, there would have been shotgun fragments buried along with it. And as one coworker said, it was almost like someone had loaded up a shotgun shell with human teeth and then just fired them at the tree. Now, this was the one scenario, no matter how unlikely, creeped the ever-living crap out of us thinking about it. In fact, just about the only comfort that we had was the idea that those teeth were old, really old, and that if their owners had suffered at all, at least it hadn't been recent. Something we maybe could have done something about and failed to. But just about the only conclusive thing the lab brought back to us was that the teeth appeared to have been buried in that tree trunk for just over a year at maximum, and that they belonged to a man in his 40s at the time of presumably death. Now that was a bitter pill to swallow, knowing that I'd actually been working as a ranger around the time of such a thing happening. The forest is a big place too, and by comparison, our ranger team is little more than a skeleton crew, so it's impossible for us to be everywhere at once. But still, it's a bitter pill to swallow. And they never did find out who those teeth belonged to, and no one could say for sure that it was murder, or that his teeth had ended up in that tree some other way. Now, I try not to think about it because when I did, it made walking among those trees all the more creepier. And even now that I'm retired, I still think about those teeth every so often and wonder how in the world they ended up deep in that tree. I've been a U.S. Forest Ranger for the better part of 3 decades, and in that time, I've heard some mighty tall tales from various hikers and campers. We've had more Bigfoot sightings than I can count, about 20-something UFO encounters, and one guy even swore that he saw Jimmy Hoffa, the union boss who disappeared, hiding out in the Barrens and living in an RV. It's not just the reports we receive either, because when certain people find out that I'm a ranger, they sometimes ask me about strange or unexplained encounters that I might have experienced while on duty. I appreciate the question, it's a lot more exciting than the stuff I'm usually asked, but unfortunately, my answers tend to disappoint them. I've never seen any kind of undocumented animals out here, nor have I seen any strange lights hovering in the sky, and the only hairy bipedal growling monsters I've seen stomping through the woods have been my coworkers during early mornings. The only thing that's ever happened that's left me truly disturbed doesn't even make for a good story, I don't think. It doesn't have a beginning, a middle, or an end. It was all just confusion, fear, and unanswered questions, and it started when a ranger named Ron went missing while out on patrol. It was a regular morning, and Ron was out performing a fire management inspection when he suddenly stopped responding to radio calls. A ranger drove out to his last known location where he found Ron's truck abandoned and his radio sitting on the passenger seat. A brief search of the area surrounding the truck yielded nothing, so by that late evening, we had state search and rescue guys out there, walking the woods with their sniffing dogs. And it turned out to be a relatively simple process of letting the dogs lead us to him, and after letting them sniff around Ron's truck for a little bit, we expected Ron to be injured in some way, as there were few other reasons why he'd just drop out of contact like that. But when we found him, it was way worse than we thought. Ron was cold, and he looked to be suffering some kind of allergic reaction. I had a cousin that was allergic to peanuts, and Ron looked and sounded exactly like my cousin did when he accidentally ate something with peanut brittle in it one Halloween. Only, it wasn't just Ron's face and neck that looked incredibly swollen. It was his arms and hands, too. They were this sort of deep pink, and the skin was so stretched and taut that it looked almost shiny. The same reddy pink discoloration was consistent all along his arms and hands, but around his fingertips, the skin had become so dark it was almost black. Now, we had a medic with us, so she rushed into action as soon as we found him. She cleared Ron's airway, put an IV in his arm, and then an ATV with a transport cot showed up to take him back to the headquarters. And from there, he was airlifted to a hospital, and by the time he was in that chopper being lifted up into the air, we were a mess. We had no idea what had happened to him out there, and what he'd done or what he'd found. Instead, just about the only thing we did know was that there was a good chance Ron wasn't going to make it. The medics who treated him looked panicked as they tried to figure out what was wrong with him, and one of them even told us straight that it wasn't looking good for him. One of the rangers, a lady named Susie, was in tears by the time we sat down in HQ again. We thought about Ron's wife and kids and how worried they must be, and it just tore us up. Over the next few days, we stayed in almost constant contact with the hospital, awaiting word of any change at all in Ron's condition. Then thankfully, our prayers were answered, and around 72 hours after he was admitted, doctors announced that he'd been stabilized and that he'd most likely pull through. A few of us went to pay him a visit and found his wife in a chair at his bedside. We were obviously very happy to see him awake and alert, so it made for an emotional reunion, but there was an elephant in the room. A very large one, too, because each of us were desperately wanting to know what the hell had happened to him. And when we asked, we were incredibly frustrated to hear that, essentially, Ron couldn't really remember what had happened to him. He remembers walking through the woods, looking for buildups of dead wood or dry pine needles, when he suddenly spotted what looked to be a piece of black volcanic rock lying on the ground. It looked very out of place in a forest with no major deposits of that kind of stuff, and so assuming it had been dropped by a hiker, Ron walked over to it and picked it up. He said nothing felt out of the ordinary at first. It felt kind of light, much like a lot of volcanic rocks, but then as he was walking with it, it started to feel very warm in his hands. This was one of the last things he remembered, as he dropped the rock, knowing that whatever was happening, it probably wasn't good for him. And he then said that looking at it just lying there on the ground was when his memory started to get very hazy. He remembered the swelling feeling and he remembered not being able to breathe properly, but after that, there was just darkness until he woke up in a hospital bed with all those tubes sticking out of him. Now, after a couple of their agents came to talk to him, Ron directed the EPA towards where he'd been patrolling, and they sent a couple of guys over to look for the rock he'd found. At first, doctors were afraid that it had been radioactive, and that Ron was suffering from some kind of acute radiation sickness. They were able to rule that out very quickly thanks to the technology they had at hand, but that only allowed them to rule out one of many possible explanations, and in order to save his life, they needed that list to get much shorter, much quicker. The medical team tried everything, but only managed to reduce the severity of Ron's condition and not alleviate it entirely, and that at some point, right around hour 60, Ron's condition began to stabilize, seemingly on its own, after which his prognosis improved dramatically. And by the time we visited, the doctors were safely able to rule out any kind of allergic reaction. But obviously they wouldn't be able to figure out exactly what had happened to Ron until the EPA was able to recover the rock that he'd touched. Only, this is where things get weird because the EPA guy couldn't find any trace of any such a volcanic rock anywhere. Now they walked over the grid squares that Ron had given them, and this was solid info because we had a digital record of where he'd been headed that morning. But after combing through the undergrowth with a fine-toothed comb for hours and hours on end, they didn't manage to find a single piece of rock fitting the description that Ron had given them. They obviously didn't want a hazardous or toxic substance getting into someone else's hand, so they tried their damnedest to find it. But they couldn't, and that scared us. Having something like that around the forest quite obviously posed a danger to the public. Now, we tried our best to warn visitors not to pick up any strange rocks and to report anything unusual directly to the Forest Service office. We were terrified the same thing would happen to a curious hiker or, God forbid, a child. But nothing ever did, and it was like that little piece of warm rock had just disappeared from the face of the earth. And without it, there was no way that we'd ever definitively find out what had happened to Ron. Ron did get better, but he never did come back to work, and he ended up getting a job working with his brother in some home renovations. It was good money, but Ron loved being a ranger, so we knew something really must have frightened him to want to throw in the towel altogether. I can't say it's kept me up at night. It's all long in the past, but I still sometimes catch myself wondering just what the hell he found out there. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, link down below, and you might be able to hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Skibbity Riz, Ohio, the zonkler hitting the gritty, drinking the grimace shake. Hey, Let's Read. I've been a fan for a long time. You're my favorite go-to sleep aid and my favorite listening while exercise guy. Two sides of an interesting coin. My husband listens sometimes too, and I recently was lamenting to him that I didn't have a scary story to send in to you, because I'd kind of love to hear you narrate something I wrote. And then my husband said, "Babe, what about the time we almost got murdered by that crazy guy when we were going to Barbara's wedding?" And I'm thinking, oh, Oh yeah, we did almost get murdered by some crazy guy, didn't we? So it turns out that I do have a story to send to you after all. And it's about the time I almost got murdered by a crazy guy. Now spoiler, he didn't succeed in the murdering. But for some context, I'm a woman and I was in my 20s when this happened. We were driving across the country to attend my sister Barbara's wedding. And I'll be honest, I can't stand her husband-to-be, Brandon, and I was a bit grumpy about having to make a 3-day journey to the East Coast in the first place. I feel like it's okay to insult Brandon since he later cheated on Barbara and divorced her, so screw you if you're listening, Brandon. Now, we were in our 20s, so this must have been maybe 1997, I think. Back before we had smartphones and GPS in every car, on every phone, and we had to rely on those horrible, huge paper maps that always tore when you were trying to unfold them. And I'm so glad that those things aren't necessary anymore. We were driving down a pretty straight, long highway, but for some reason, hubby had decided to unfurl the map to see what was coming up, I guess. And when he told me to pull over, which seemed pretty safe since we hadn't seen a car for miles, and there was a pretty flat verge to pull onto, I was kind of puzzled. And then he pointed to the map, at really nothing to be precise. And then he pointed across the desert a little ways, and I saw what he was getting at. There was a town, or part of one anyway, and it looked a bit run down, that wasn't on our map, and we made sure to get the latest revision. Now, this would happen sometimes with certain landmarks or areas. If they were demolished or no longer relevant, then they'd just simply be taken off the map. And so the town, which was clearly some sort of ghost town, wasn't marked down on the map because presumably nobody would have any reason to go there, and so there was no point wasting the ink to print an indicator that the town used to be there, I guess. Now, naturally, this meant that hubby and I both wanted to check out this town that wasn't worth including on the map. Now, our 4x4 was pretty robust, and we were on a fairly smooth area of the desert, so we felt comfortable driving off-road a ways until we were closer to said town. Now, it wasn't too hot that day either, so we walked the remaining 20 minutes. When we got closer, it seemed more apparent that the town was a little more complete than we'd first thought. However, we were kind of nervous because there were signs up on the remaining broken-down buildings claiming that they'd been condemned by a company that I forgot the name of now by order of the state. So we explored with nervous trepidation. It was eerie, seeing this place in the middle of nowhere that looked like it had just been abandoned probably in the 1950s. Now, I could tell it was probably around then based on the dates on the signs and just what it generally looked like. Now, my husband called me over to this one building which appeared to be some sort of mining office. The door was missing, so we were able to enter, being as careful as we could with the floor. Now, he showed me a metal sign that talked about how the miners should report to the foreman if they're experiencing dizziness or nausea, and that while there was no evidence of some natural gas leak, the company, goddamn, I do wish I remembered the name, wanted to watch out for its employees. Now, I made some kind of remark about how these days they just tell the miners to take an aspirin and keep inhaling the asbestos or whatever it was, and my husband laughed at me for mentioning asbestos as natural gas, and this sent me into fits of laughter. And I guess that's what alerted the guy, or woke him up, or whatever. I just heard this sort of cry of, "They're back!" and then heard these heavy footsteps coming running from what sounded like a few buildings away. Now, hubby and I looked at each other, not sure what to do, stepped outside, my heart was pounding. Now, my husband did have an open carry permit at the time and had his gun on a visible holster on his shoulder, so we hoped that this by itself would diffuse whatever situation was about to arise. Now, coming up Main Street of this ghost town was this tall, wiry man with a big, bushy beard. Now, he was very chunky for someone who looked like he'd been living off the land for years, and wore this biker's jacket that had probably been black once, but was caked brown with so much dust you couldn't tell. He also wore torn jeans that weren't much cleaner, and weirdly though, I noticed that his boots were absolutely spotless, like he polished them every day. And it made me think that he was some sort of ex-military guy, and shining his boots was the one thing that had stuck in his mind. Now, the guy started yelling at us about how he knew that we were company men. Yes, men, even though, I'm a woman, and we'd finally come to try and force him out. Now, we insisted that we had no idea what he was talking about, then we weren't with the company, and we just stumbled upon the town and decided to take a quick peek at what was going on with these ruins. Now, this man comes forward, and my husband reached for his gun. Now, the guy barely even seemed to register it or care as my hubby unholstered it, although he did stop a few feet away from us, so maybe that was for protection. Who knows? Now, it was hard to tell, given the insane rant that he went on next. He started yelling about how the town had been evacuated in the 50s when he was a boy of 18 who just started working in the mines like he dreamed of all of his life. No way was he giving that up, and he refused to leave. And he found a way to get down into those mines and proudly announced that he'd continue to work down there until there was no more coal veins to tap. Now, he said that over time they evacuated the townsfolk in big trucks, and he knew that they took them into the tunnels under the town. He said that the claims of some gas leak was a total lie, and there was definitely no carbon monoxide in the air because look at him, he's fine. And somehow I didn't see this guy as the poster child for someone who doesn't have mild carbon monoxide poisoning. And then he offered to take us down into those tunnels, where he could show us the remains of the experiments that they'd done down there. He begins to rant about how they tried to fuse people with the rocks and create soldiers out of the rocks and all sorts of other insane crap involving experimenting on people with the rocks. We politely declined his offer to accompany him down into those tunnels, figuring that the only rock that we'd be encountering is the one that he'd used to bash our heads in. Now, this enraged him so instantly and suddenly that my husband didn't even have time to flick the safety off. This hobo charged him and sent the gun flying out of his hand, and then he pushed him to the ground and started choking him out. Now, my husband was a newly minted cop, and he was a bit of a gym bro, so he wasn't exactly some pushover. But this large old hobo drifter had him pinned and was choking him so bad that my husband genuinely could not pull the guy's hands from his throat. I had no idea what to do. I didn't know where the gun had been knocked to, and I couldn't just tackle this dude. But then it hit me. There were rocks all over the path, and I grabbed one that looked like just the right size, not to kill him, but to send him falling back, and threw it straight at his head. Now, I expected it to hit him in the temple and knock him sideways maybe, or disorient him, but my aim was slightly off, and I winced as the rock connected with the man's jaw, causing a very loud crack and his bottom jaw to just kind of go limp. Now, I took this change to now barrel into him like some football player or something and knock him off of my husband, who had already started to loosen the guy's grip on his throat. Now, we turned around and ran for it. I've never ran so fast or so frantically in my life. My husband and I stayed hand in hand to stop each other from slipping on the desert sand as we ran back to our vehicle. Now, I guess this transient found my husband's gun because we heard the sound of it going off, which thankfully seemed to come from nowhere near us. We reached the vehicle, got in, peeled out of there, and then just drove and drove and drove until we found the next rest stop and could call the cops. Now, my husband, being a police officer himself, explained that he was now off duty, obviously, and his personal weapon had been acquired by our assailant, so if they were going to go to that ghost town, they might want to consider the suspect an armed and dangerous one. Now, we waited at the rest stop for 8 hours until an officer arrived. The nearest town was some ways away, and it had taken them a long old while to reach the abandoned town. When they got there was no sign of this guy despite searching all the buildings. They did manage to retrieve my husband's firearm, which they did have to take in for evidence and examine, and they also said that there was no evidence of any entrance into any of the tunnels, and explained that the town had been evacuated back in the 1950s, like the man had claimed, due to a genuine gas leak in those mines. Now, we stayed at the adjoining motel at the rest stop, which put us out of schedule, and it meant that we were almost late for Barbara's wedding, and frankly, I think missing her wedding would have caused more threatening behavior than the hobo ever could. I do wonder what became of that guy. Now, he's probably obviously dead by now, as he was an old man back in the 90s, but you never know. Maybe huffing all that carbon monoxide or being part of his imaginary rock experiments means he's still out there somewhere, ranting about being evicted by the company. Good evening, Let's Read. Well, probably afternoon for you, if it's evening for me. You see, I live in a country in Europe. I won't say exactly where because even after all these years, I could get into trouble for speaking out against my own government. The kind of trouble that costs you a pound of flesh, if you know what I mean. Our ruling has always been dictatorial, but it was worse back then. Back then is around 50 years ago when I was just out of my teenage years. Now, perhaps you've heard of Centralia, an abandoned town in Pennsylvania that's, from what I understand, is always on fire. Underground, anyways, and I assume you've heard of it. It's a very famous tale here in Europe and inspired a lot of fiction and art. Not every town is as lucky as Centralia when it comes to awareness and the treatment of its residents, though. Now, I'm sure they don't feel that way. I know that many of them felt forced out of their homes, and I sympathize deeply. And when I say lucky, I of course also don't mean that they experienced any kind of luck. What I mean is that there are some towns where terrible things happen to cause them to become abandoned, and governments such as ours will cover it up and force the residents to go and find new locations to live, with only the smallest stipend to cover the cost of relocation. And this is what happened to my town when I was 23. Now obviously I cannot name the town because I cannot name the country, but you'd have to dig pretty deeply to find any meaningful records or evidence of what went on anyway. I made the mistake in the past of talking about this too loudly and too frequently and came dangerously close to shooting myself in the foot, as they say. And so, for a bit of background about our town, it wasn't even a town really, it was sort of a tiny village tucked into the mountains. Now we knew that the other side of the mountain range was riddled with mines and various mineral mining operations, but as far as we were aware, the land beneath our village was solid and no mining operations were conducted anywhere near our place of living. Now this seemed to be true. We never saw construction vehicles or knew of any mines nearby. And then one day, a supposed construction company moved into the village to build what they called a refuge into the mountainside. They wouldn't explain to us exactly what this was or who it was a refuge for, but it involved some machinery that I'd never seen for basic construction, like a bore drill with tank-like tracks to drill into the mountainside. Now 3 days after the company moved in, we were all awoken by what felt like an earthquake and rumbling under our feet that caused pictures to fall off of walls and plates to fall out of cabinets. Now we had never once had an earthquake in the area, not once, and I don't even know if they really work like that halfway up on a mountain. But we were all certain that we'd felt an earthquake as we came running out of our houses. At this time it was just past 5 a.m. The sun was starting to rise and some of us were still in our night clothes, and I remember one of my neighbors sobbing and screaming that the rapture was coming. It was honestly insanity. We began to gather in the street when suddenly we had to clear out of the way. A bunch of the construction company's vehicles were speeding through the village and down the road. Now, I couldn't help but notice that the drill wasn't there, although even if it was, it would have moved at a much slower pace. Now, we didn't receive answers for 2 days. The earthquake had broken our ill-maintained telephone poles, and we were essentially stranded, left to pick up the pieces and clean up our houses after the quake. Now, eventually, the technicians came in to fix the telephone poles, including a much-needed upgrade, and with them came a representative from that construction company. There had been an explosion in the mines, he said, and when we questioned him on what he meant by mines, he quickly changed his story. The explosion had been in the refuge that they were constructing, and he was just used to talking about mines, so he'd made a slip of the tongue. And of course, this is when I first got suspicious. Now, this man explained that the mountainside had become unstable and our little town was in danger of possibly a landslide. He said that the government had agreed to offer us all a small stipend to relocate and that the new housing site around the base of the mountain had enough unsold properties for all of us to move in for cheap. Now, of course, we later discovered that the materials used to build the new housing development was extremely subpar and, surprise, surprise, the housing development had been built by the same construction company who were building the refuge. Now, a few days after the construction company representative had left, promising that we'd all receive relocation packets in the mail, I decided to sneak to the construction site. Now imagine my surprise, instead of an abandoned site and signs of some explosion, There were two armed guards and clear evidence that the construction work was still underway. There was no way that I was risking getting shot to death. Curiosity killed the cat, I like to say, so it was a case of having to relocate with my parents and the rest of the town. For something that wasn't our fault, and it sure ended up costing us more than the government offered. But like I said, our government isn't the one that allows you to just complain. Life went on, but I could never get our old town out of my head. I developed this theory, though, that there was no accidental explosion. It was a rigged explosion designed to cause us to leave, and that there was no refuge, whatever that meant, but they discovered veins of some kind of ore in the tunnels in our part of the mountain. But mining there would have been dangerous with a populated village, even if it had only about 50 or so people. Much easier to fake a disaster and force us to relocate. I moved on and moved to a different part of the country. My parents had passed on not long after we relocated and caught in some fatal car accident caused by a drunk driver at the wheel, who, of course, had the pleasure of surviving. I had nothing keeping me in this new housing estate. No memories, no connections, and always been a loner, always kept to myself, and I'd been homeschooled and had never bothered to make friends my age. So I traveled the country for a while and then settled down far from where I grew up. But still, the old town was on my mind, and so one day I decided to track down some of the families that I'd grown up with just to check in, except I couldn't. For most of them, it was like they'd simply disappeared. I found a handful of obituaries, names that I recognized, and in one case, an entire family of 4 who'd passed within a period of 2 years. I managed to get a hold of a few families, and not one of them wanted to hear from me. They didn't say so, of course. They were all far too polite for that, but you could tell that they wanted to get me off the phone as soon as possible. One person even got pretty angry at the fact that I'd managed to track them down, until I explained that they were in the phone book, and their answer is that I'll have to rectify that. Other than all feeling very hostile, the few villagers that I spoke to all had one other thing in common. They all sounded kind of sick. They all had coughs, every one of them, and they all had this same raspy quality to their voices. Now, I can't entirely explain this, but the most logical explanation to me is that whatever that fault line they opened when they created the explosion to access the mine, it unleashed some type of fumes or burned some type of material that affected almost all of the population. I made my final call in 1992, and the next day I received a knock at the door. Now, I answered to be greeted by 2 government officials who flashed some official badges at me. They wore these black suits, sunglasses, and to me were genuinely men in black. Only they weren't here to silence me about anything fun like aliens. Instead, I was warned to stop harassing the families that I'd lived alongside in the housing estate. And finally, they warned that if I knew what was good for me, I would forget that I ever grew up in a mountain town, and that I'd certainly never been in proximity to some explosion of any sort. And then one of the agents brushed his jacket aside, revealing a firearm, and I was suitably silenced at that point. Whatever happened in my town will forever remain a mystery. While there are mysteries surrounding Centralia, my tale proves that it could be a lot worse. Not that it's some competition, but to me, both truly were tragedies. The story that I want to send you happened in the early 2000s, when me and my friends were a bit more reckless and crazy than we are now. These days we prefer a quiet beer on the lawn while the kids play in the pool. Our days of exploring random abandoned towns and desert death traps are over. It's like they say, getting old sucks, but everyone's doing it. Now, I can't remember which one of us had the bright idea. There was me, my name's Carl, my friend Richie, Sam, and Carson. It was probably Sam. He was always the one with crazy ideas about outdoor adventures. And I just don't want to 100% put the blame at his feet just in case. You know, all I know is that it wasn't me who suggested that we become wilderness explorers with absolutely no experience or knowledge. Now, I was all okay, so we just gonna do a bunch of reading and buy all this equipment on some meager budget and stuff, and Whoever's idea it was turned to me and said, "No, we're just gonna do it." Okay, I know it wasn't Carson who suggested it actually, and you'll see why later. Now, Carson's the hero of this story, and you should know that straight up. I don't think he's paid for a single beer when he's been with us for the last 23 years. He's a legend of a man and also a very quiet fella. Now anyway, the culprit, who I'm getting increasingly certain was Sam, explained that there was a ghost town in the desert, just 50 miles from the Arizona town that we all lived in. Now I said, "You mean a haunted town?" And I was only half joking because I didn't really know what a ghost town really was. Now Sam, "Oh yeah, sorry Sam, you're getting the blame and I remembered it was you." He responds, "No, you dingus. A ghost town is one of those old towns, usually from maybe the Wild West, abandoned when they realized there was no gold in them thar hills, or, pillaged by bandits or other folks." Now, I'm not sure he said exactly that, then there was probably a lot more slurs and cursing since it was Sam, but that was the gist of it. And so we set off, the four of us completely unprepared to explore a desert town 50 miles from home. At least we brought plenty of water and had the foresight to pack warm clothes for those chilly desert nights. Our plan was to reach the ghost town by nightfall, sleep in the car, and then explore by day. Now, we'd been driving for around 40 miles when we saw a group of guys with trucks who'd pitched some tents around. From the looks of things, they'd been living in the desert for a bit, and they'd set up a little bit of a commune or something. They looked like good-time lads, kind of like us, really. Our age, quietly laughing and just drinking beers around a campfire. Now, they must have noticed that we'd slowed as we passed them, and one of them waved for us to stop. Now, I was the driver, so I did and wound down the window. The guy invited us to chill with them because they hardly ever saw anyone come out this way, and certainly not fellas their age. They looked a bit hillbilly, but I mean, really, we were from southern Arizona, so were we. And we piled out of the car and perched ourselves on nearby crates and logs while our new friends kindly offered us some beers. Now, we offered them some cans in exchange, but they weren't having any of it. We were their guests. They were fun, really jokey, honestly, and made us laugh a whole bunch. Now, Sam especially seemed to fit in well with them, being the hick that he is, and only Carson seemed to keep to himself, just offering a polite smile and laugh occasionally. Now, while Carson was always the quiet one, he was usually a little more sociable than this, and I wondered if something was bothering him. It soon came up as to why we were driving through the desert at sunset, since we were clearly locals heading away from town. Sam, without a thought, told them that we'd heard about this ghost town nearby, and we wanted to explore when the sun came up. Now, immediately, these desert dwellers started putting on some fake 80s gas station attendant voices, like, "Y'all don't want to go down there. That place is cursed. You kids stay away from that town, you hear? There's nothing to be found but death." And the best one, the guy who told a story about how the town was abandoned because it had fallen victim to a skindigo, which is sort of like a Wendigo meets a skinwalker apparently, and only happens when the dog man has sex with a Jersey Devil. Now, it's a pretty epic story, and it caused them to break character and descend into fits of laughter. They did tell us, however, that the town was better explored at night if we had some pretty powerful flashlights and equipment. In the daytime, all we'd see is rotting bits of wood and remnants of a long-abandoned town, but if you go there at night, you'll see fireflies and feel this whole atmosphere that gives the place a completely different angle. And now that I think about it, they were really insistent that we explore at night, and maybe that should have been a red flag. The group suddenly announced that since the sun had set and it was starting to get cold, they'd be going to their tents, so they wished us luck in our explorations. They said to say hello if we ever came out this way again and encountered them. And so we got back in my vehicle, this fairly new SUV that I was very proud of at the time, and headed the final 10 miles in to the ghost town. Sam was riding shotgun, which meant that I didn't get a chance to talk to Carson, who'd been up front with me for most of the ride. Sam insisted on blasting 80s rock through my stereo system, so no conversation of any kind was really possible. Finally, we could see the rotting logs that made up the remains of the entrance to the ghost town. We stopped the vehicle about 20 feet away and just straight up began walking towards the town. Carson stopped us. He told us that he actually had a bit of experience with wilderness survival, and having been quite a big player in the Scouts in his youth, he didn't make it sound that gay, he asked us if we'd let him go first. Now, I took the opportunity to ask what was wrong, and he said that he'd been getting odd vibes from those guys back at that tent. Now, I was surprised. They seemed fine, and then he explained that their trucks had only recently been parked there. They had fairly deep tire tracks that he noticed, and he also said that he'd spotted a number of shotguns and rifles just lying around inside their tents and in the truck beds. I hadn't seen any of this, and to this day, this is why Carson is our goddamn hero. And so he approached first, and we followed behind him. His flashlight was mostly sweeping the sandy floor for some reason, and every time we tried to ask him anything, he just sort of shush us. Now, he seemed to study the two poles serving as the town's entrance for quite a while, especially shining his flashlight in between them. When he was satisfied, he took a few steps inside and then stopped. He pointed to two small poles stretched further across the entrance, and then told us to look at this. He shone his flashlight between them, and then, there glinting in the light, was very clear metal wire. It didn't look like the garrote wire or piano wire or anything that would slice your head or feet off, but it certainly was some kind of tripwire designed to do something. "We're leaving. Now," Carson said, and none of us disagreed with him. And then as we turned to exit through the entrance poles, all at once, I felt something bite into my ankle. Now at first, I thought it was a damn snake had gotten to me, but then the pain grew worse and spread across my whole ankle, and I started screaming in pain. Carson shone the flashlight down, and I'd stepped on a goddamn animal trap. It looked like something designed to trap a coyote or a fox, so nothing as lethal or life-ruining as a bear trap, but it still hurt like a bitch mother effer, and I reached down to try and pry it off of my ankle, but Carson instantly stopped me and said that that would probably increase the blood loss, and we had a fairly long drive to the nearest medical service even if we put the pedal to the metal. It also meant that I couldn't be the one to drive my precious SUV, which was hell unto itself. And for some reason, in the haze of all my pain that I felt, I let Sam take the wheel. Carson couldn't drive, and Richie said that he wanted to sit in the back with me because he apparently had some first aid techniques that would help me out. Now, this turned out to be that he had a bunch of oxy with him, which most definitely wasn't his prescription, and he kept promising me that he wasn't some addict or anything, but at that moment, I didn't care. He slipped me a tablet, and slowly the pain from my trap-snapped ankle started to ease. I asked him if I could have another, and after some soul-searching, he gave me half. Now, meanwhile, Sam was proving to be a pretty competent nighttime desert driver, and Carson was plotting the best route to the nearest walk-in clinic or hospital once we got back to town. Then up ahead, Sam yelled that he saw those guys from before and maybe they could help us. Except immediately, Carson told him to floor it. The guys, who'd clearly seen us coming, were scrambling out of their tents into one of the beat-up trucks, and all of them seemed to be packing old-ass, ill-maintained shotguns and rifles. But even a crappy rifle can put a bullet in you. Sam, to his credit, absolutely gunned it like he was set to win the Dakar rally. And I mean, damn, with those skills, I'm convinced that maybe he could have been a rally driver, just not in my SUV. Now, we were pretty big distance from the desert hillbilly camp when the first shot rang out. I had no idea where it went because you'd have to have been an award-winning sniper to hit a moving target at that distance. And then they left off a few more shots, and again, nothing came close to hitting us, thankfully. And finally, they released some volley of shots that seemed to be fired into the air, maybe in anger or intimidation, and I think they knew that they'd lost us. My heart was pounding, I was sweating, and thanks to Sam and mostly to Carson, we made our way back to our town, and I was able to receive medical treatment. We'd done the right thing by not removing the trap, and I was kind of still high on the oxy, so I was a little paranoid that they'd start asking about that. They didn't, and later Richie told me that nobody would have begrudged me for indulging in a little illegal perk when I had a coyote trap around my foot. While I was in the hospital, accompanied by Richie, Carson and Sam went to the local police station, who knew us from some of our infamous high school antics but kind of liked us all the same, and they explained the situation, and the cops told them that they thought that they knew who these boys were. A group of brothers, a cousin, and a friend from a nearby trailer park who all had warrants out for their arrests. Now, nothing serious, but they did have a history of putting traps around their trailer park and befriending tourists only to rob them. Now, this would be the first time that they targeted locals, though. The cops told Carson and Sam that we might all be called in for trial and further statements, and I had to give a statement from my hospital bed where I spent 5 excruciatingly boring days. Now, thankfully, we never had to go to court because I guess whatever went down when the cops confronted them far exceeded whatever happened with us. And my guess is something escalated, prison time, and there was a story in the local paper about something similar, but for some reason there were no details of the assailants or any identifying information. Now, we all still live in that Arizona town. We've all made our lives and careers here, and anyone who says that you can't make it if you stay in your hometown is lying. We all do well for ourselves, and we're all still friends to this day. Like I said, Carson's never had to pay for another drink with us again, and Sam gets a few freebies too, because there's always that nagging feeling that maybe he was the one who suggested it in the first place, so he doesn't push back when it's his round. Either way, that was our one and only attempt at dipping our toes into what you might call Urbex. Well, Desert X, I guess. Gaming, arcades, bowling, and snowboarding for us going forward, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Yo, Joel, good to finally write in and meet you, kinda. So basically, when I was growing up and in my first year of college, I got dared by my buddies to spend the night in the local haunted cemetery. Woo, spooky. The town I grew up in had a great college, and so I got in there and was able to live at home, too. It was a bonus. Growing up, we'd always known that the cemetery attached to St. Augustine's of Christ was haunted. It just had this aura at night, you know? Obviously, all cemeteries are spooky at night, but this one was different. We tried partying there when we were maybe 15 and my brother bought us alcohol. Now, out of 7 of us, boys and girls, not one of us got even a buzz out of the beers, and it was like there was this pressure in the air that I don't really know how to describe it. Have you ever been to a place that just feels bad? You can't explain it, it just does. It has a sort of aura of darkness. Now, I guess I should explain a little about St. Augustine's of Christ, the cemetery, and where exactly it is. It wasn't in our town. It was in a nearby ghost town that had been abandoned in the mid-1800s when the population grew so small thanks to a contaminated well that the remaining townsfolk moved to a bigger town with better job prospects, better community, and obviously better water. And I think after the sickness died off, there were around 5 families left in the town and 2 young widows. You can't blame them for not staying. And now one of the widows worked in the government in some kind of high-up position, and through whatever chicanery, apparently involving the Pinkertons, she managed to set up a deal via her government contacts where the land was sold to a company who were now planning to develop on it. Now, we never did find out what they were planning to develop because the owner disappeared shortly after with the contents of the entire bank account of said institution and probably spent like the last years living it up on a beach somewhere. And so that business folded, but technically they weren't bankrupt or liquidated. I don't know, I'm not some business major, I don't understand all that shiz, but the point is, this town ended up being owned by essentially nobody. Nobody could move in, nobody could develop there, and nobody could do anything except allow it to just fall into ruin. It was maybe a 90-minute drive from our town, but there was really no reason to visit. It was just a bunch of sad, boarded-up houses that reminded us of everything we lost in the early years of medicinal treatment and how everything dies eventually. It's a nice feeling. Now, of course, it would have been a fantastic place for the local kids to go out and party, but none of us want to. And this went back generations, and is still the case to this day as far as I know. The town itself was a little unsafe because there were potential predators in the area, the animal kind, I guess maybe the human kind too. And the cemetery was safer because you could lock up the gates still and have yourself a kegger, but as I said, the one time we tried, it never felt right. The cemetery was kind of on a small hill with the abandoned church at the peak, and none of us even entertained the idea of breaking in or vandalizing the cemetery or the town. It was like, F it. I sound like a moron for saying this, but it was like it was under some kind of protection, and I do not mean from God. It felt cursed. So obviously, when I was new to college and the girl I had a major crush on dared me to spend the night in St. Augustine of Christ Cemetery, I agreed. And she also hinted that she'd be very impressed with me if I did it like I was some kind of hero or something, and that was really enough for me. I mean, it had been 3 years since the ill-fated kegger among the tombstones. I'm sure I'd hyped it up in my mind so it felt worse than it was. I could do this. I could drive there, camp there overnight, maybe grab a couple of sleeping pills from my dealers so I didn't even have to worry about staying up, and then I'd use this disposable camera that I brought to prove that I'd stay there by taking photos of my watch, the sunset, the nighttime, and various bits of proof. I did suggest that someone accompany me, ideally the girl who dared me, to prove that I was on the level, but nobody wanted to do it. And so I sucked it up, and during my little spring break, I drove to the ghost town. I tried not to look at the houses slowly rotting away as I walked to the gates of the cemetery. Now thankfully they were still able to be opened and able to be sealed shut by a metal sliding lock, so no predators would be getting in. Apparently there had been mountain lion sightings about 100 miles away or so, and while that sounded like nothing, I didn't want to risk anything. Plus coyotes have been seen in the area, and okay, I didn't want anyone coming into the cemetery without me being alerted. And that's when I realized the problem with the sleeping pill idea. I brought a couple of super strength Ambien from my dealer, and as someone who'd never taken Ambien before, I was pretty sure that was just one that would knock me out for the whole night, even if a serial killer broke in and ripped me to shreds. So I left them at home, hidden in the secret compartment of my drawer that I found out years later Mom had always known about. And so I had around 14 hours to kill. The sun hadn't even set yet, and I was getting bored. And I tried to do some reading for school, and that got boring. And then I tried to read a few comics, and even they couldn't keep my attention. I just had this creeping dread around my heart all the time. I snapped awake. I had somehow drifted off to sleep outside the tent on the hard dirt floor, and by now the sun had already set. There was a light breeze coming from the east, and these voices were carried on the breeze. It seemed like there were 2 female voices, and they were speaking in what I can only describe as like 1800s vernacular. Vague hints about witchcraft and sacrifice and burning people alive. And of course, this made me feel extremely safe, and I was glad that I had my Bowie knife with me at the very least. Then from the other side of the town, more distant sounding than the witchcraft talk, but fighting against the wind, I could hear what sounded like a fire and brimstone preacher. It was the most surreal experience. A preacher with a deep, booming voice quoting Bible passages in the far distance on one side of me, and then 2 admittedly seductive-sounding women talking like witches on the other. I decided that since I was in some churchyard, the preacher would already be here if this was his stomping grounds, and the witches wouldn't come close. Or it was my friends just trying to freak me out. Now that was the most obvious, most likely, and almost certainly the true answer. I tucked into my tent and hid. Nothing happened for about an hour or so, and then I heard the rusty creaking of the cemetery gate being opened. I didn't think. I literally just noped out of the tent, swinging my knife around, hoping that I could out-crazy whoever was out there. Now I was met by 2 girls, wearing goth makeup, around my age, who screamed the place down when they saw me. They turned to run when I desperately began calling out that I thought that they were witches, and that I dared to spend the night there, etc., etc. Now one of them turned around and asked if my name was X. Now I'm not going to dox myself here, I'm just using that as a placeholder, and I said that yeah, it was, and that's when I recognized the girls. They actually went to my college. They were freshmen too, and they just didn't normally dress like that. They were kind of normal-looking art students, so I hadn't recognized them in the moment. No, I won't bore you with a lengthy explanation on how we smoothed everything out, but it turns out that they'd come to this ghost town to do a photo shoot for their final project, which was, quote, shameful history. And they told me that the story about the town wasn't quite what we'd heard. In the initial days of the well turning bad, 2 women had been punished for witchcraft by throwing them down the already deceased well, with claims that they'd cursed the town with some sickness. I'm sure that the 2 corpses down there really helped, right? Now, this is what they were photographing, posing as the 2 women and creating some superimposed imagery showing them looking up from the well, trapped down there. And it all sounded really cool and really interesting and thankfully not cursed. Now, I jokingly asked if they wanted to camp with me to help me win the bet, and I genuinely think that they might have said yes if it wasn't for the bad vibes in the place. Now, there was a moment when they hesitated and I thought that I'd hit a home run, but then they said they had to get back and invited me to at least walk them to their car, which was parked around the side of the town. I began to accompany them when we heard the booming footsteps, and then that booming voice rang out and he sounded very close, like he was just around the corner behind us. Now, I can't 100% remember exactly which Bible passages he was quoting, but I've included a few that I'm certain I heard him growl after us. "A man or a woman who is a medium or spiritist among you must be put to death. You are to stone them. Their blood will be on their own heads." And then a pause as we started to walk quicker, not wanting to run in case it caused the man, who so far was just stomping along, to speed up. Next he said, "Do not turn to mediums or seek out spiritists, for you will be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God." And we started to jog now, and I glanced backwards. This huge man in a long, dusty leather coat was slowly striding towards us. He was barely a silhouette in the darkness, but I could see the white glow of some sort of collar at his throat. Now, when he saw me looking at him, he boomed this: "Submit yourself then to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you." And finally, as we all broke into a run, the preacher did not seem to speed up at all, and yet he was still getting closer. Now, I remember this quote for definite because it was the last thing he said to us, and it bounced around in my head over the years. "But the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, the adulterers and all liars, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is the second death." We reached the girls' car. One of them got behind the wheel and the other dived into the back seat with me, and we just hightailed it out of there. And if the preacher was shouting anything else, I couldn't hear it. But I did look back through the rear window and saw him holding up some old-school crucifix in one hand, or at least shining, sort of, and a Bible in the other, I think. And as we were nearly home, the girls asked if I'd like to come back to their shared apartment to chill out and debrief and maybe even smoke something to calm us down. I said that no, if it was okay, I'd rather just be given a ride home because I was so freaked out that I really wouldn't make for good company in this moment. Now, it was only later that I realized that I just rejected 2 hot goth chicks inviting me back to their apartment, but I was always absolutely useless with women, and this was the part my now girlfriend was teasing me about. Now, these days, I am kind of a religious man. I don't camp overnight in cemeteries, and I kind of feel like the preacher was giving me a bit of a warning. I don't know what that warning was, but I know that if he'd caught up with any of us, it would not have been good. I left that town and that state now, but occasionally a buddy tells me a rumor about the ghost town. A crucified body found in the churchyard, but of course I can never find anything about it, like he said, and a group of teens who were scared off by a guy who looked like the Undertaker. Now that one I can believe. I don't know what I encountered that day, but I do know that I go to church every Sunday and pray to God every night, and I think I genuinely believe, and it's not just fear. So whatever that preacher did, or might have done, I think he set my life on the track that I'm happy with, so you might have been out to kill me, But you didn't, and for that, all is forgiven. This event played out in 2001, a few months before everything changed. I lived in Cali and I'd recently gotten heavily into analog photography, and digital was almost unheard of back then and certainly not very good at the time. I've been taking photos of things all around the California desert, really focusing on outdoor sunset shots and things like that. Then I'd heard about this old ghost town around 5 hours away. If I took a thermos of coffee and started early, I could make it there and back with plenty of time to spend photographing the old ruins. And I saw some photos in a book in the library, and there didn't seem to be any real modern pictures of the place. It had likely rotten to almost nothing now, but that in and of itself was interesting to me. And so I headed out one chilly morning on a day that promised to be hot with a little bit of a breeze, which is a rare treat around here. Now, I don't think I saw a single other vehicle on the drive to the ghost town. Maybe I did and I wasn't paying attention, but I'm usually a pretty attentive person to things like that. Now, I started to revel in the loneliness. Maybe it was silly for me at a then 23-year-old woman to enjoy isolation and being in the middle of nowhere, but hey, my survival instincts had never been very good. Now, eventually I see a pole or two in the distance that signaled the ghost town. I drove off-road and across the sand for as far as I was comfortable with in my old car and then trekked the rest of the way. And the moment I reached the town, I could tell that something just felt wrong. It wasn't just the feeling of wrongness, although that was certainly there, an unpleasant vibe that made me want to just turn tail and run before I'd even begun. But it was what lay around the ruins and foundations of this town that really unsettled me. I'd learned that the town had been abandoned after the gold rush, when there were no more work to be had and the nearby areas had been tapped, so they just sort of upped and let it die. And that sense of death had clearly remained, because scattered around the town were numerous coyote corpses, all in various stages of decay. Now, I could only tell that they were coyotes because the corpse nearest me was, well, fresh. A macabre part of me thought about taking a photograph, but it felt a bit too morbid. I was about to just up and get out of there when something in the center of the main street caught my eye. Someone was lying on the floor, face up. And I had no choice but to approach, and my eyes were darting around in case this was some kind of trap. No, it most definitely wasn't. The guy laying on the desert ground was dead as dead could be. His skin was shriveled to a paper-thin coating, and bones poked through in places where the epidermis had given up the ghost. He had no eyeballs, of course, and empty, abyssal sockets just gazed up at me. The weirdest thing was he dressed in the garb of someone from at least 20 years ago, and this didn't look like some homeless person had just dropped dead here yesterday. It looked like this man had been dead for a couple of decades, and yet he lay almost on top of the sand, barely covered, as if he'd been exhumed for some purpose. Now, I studied a forensic pathology module at college just before dropping out, so I had a little insight into what I was looking at, and I couldn't see any obvious wounds or causes of death. It was almost like he just laid down and died. And instead of the sand covering his body over the subsequent 20 years, just like the coyotes, he was somehow left visible. I headed off quickly and drove straight home, where I called the cops, and they promised to call me back, and a few days later they did. They said that their pathologist agreed with me that he just laid down and died. There was no sign of some heart attack or anything like that. It was almost like his body had just sort of stopped. Now, this can happen sometimes when someone gets really old or really sick, and when I asked if this guy had been sick, I was told that the pathologist hadn't been able to comment on that, as she hadn't found any evidence of anything directly fatal. No hits to the head, no broken bones of any sort. It was all just very strange. I asked about the coyotes, and they said that this was the jurisdiction of the wildlife department, who hadn't told them anything, so that was just another mystery that I never got solved. I kind of wish that no matter how grim it would have been, I had taken photographs of everything after, but it just felt so disrespectful. I really do think that someone just dug that body up and moved it from some graveyard far away. Now, around a decade later, I was driving down the same road for a much lengthier, days-long road trip, and I saw the location where the town had been and the way the wood had rotted even further. I thought about stopping and going over to take another look, but something stopped me. A kind of darkness that gripped my heart, a voice in my head that said no. And I've long since learned that when my instincts tell me not to do something, I should listen. So as far as I know, that town's still out there, and who knows what might find you if you went there today. I know that I, for one, do not want to find out. Imagine, if you will, a quiet country town. During its heyday, from the swinging 60s to the synth-laden 80s, the population fluctuated around the 1,000 mark. That was the population of this specific town in 1980, and by 1990, just a decade later, the population had dropped to just 63 souls living in the, some would say, cursed, town of Centralia. Centralia is perhaps the most famous ghost town of our time, although strictly speaking it's not entirely a ghost town yet. As of now, 5 residents still remain in the town that never stops burning. The reason for Centralia, Pennsylvania's abrupt abandoning is the stuff of nightmares, but the timeline of events is what makes it especially scary. Nobody can agree exactly on what caused the underground fire that caused the anthracite coal beneath the town to begin burning. Some say it was the regular burning of the town dump. Others claim the fire had started the day before, caused by the dumping of hot coal or ash. Some people believe that the fire had actually been burning since 1932, slowly reaching the mines under the town in the 1960s. The local residents knew vaguely that there was a small fire problem with the disused mining tunnels beneath the town, but it wasn't until 1979, 17 years later, that the townsfolk started to discover the severity of the issue. Now imagine this. You've been living above a slow-burning, potentially lethal fire for 17 years. Essentially, you've been living above hell. And in 1981, the first near tragedy hit the town. A 12-year-old kid named Todd fell into a sinkhole, a mere 4 feet wide but 150 feet deep. The hole suddenly opened beneath his feet in his grandmother's backyard. Due to the blast of the heat and sudden disappearance of the ground, the boy must have felt like he was about to be dragged down to Hades itself. Thankfully, Todd managed to grab hold of a tree root, and his cousin had the chance to play the hero by dragging him to safety. The steam from the sinkhole was tested and found to contain lethal levels of carbon monoxide. Even after Todd's near tragedy, townsfolk were divided on how serious the issue actually was. Evidence of the fire under the town grew and grew, as did the bitter resentment and arguing between those who wanted to up sticks and leave and those who weren't prepared to give up their home. But the government put $42 million in the relocation efforts, and eventually nearly all the residents decided having a very real representation of hell beneath their feet wasn't worth the nostalgia. And by 1990, just 63 people remained. By 2010, only 5 homes were left in Centralia. Hundreds of buildings had been demolished and eminent domain had been invoked on all property in the borough. Now, the fire also spread to a nearby town, ironically named Burnsville, which as of today had been completely evacuated. That one's a true ghost town, if it can even be considered to exist at all anymore. Centralia is still burning. It'll burn underground for another 250 years. Whether humanity will take it upon themselves to rebuild the town for tourism or nostalgia or just a testament to the human spirit, I guess we'll never know in our lifetimes. But for now, based on the last census in 2020, 5 people remain in Centralia, and only one of them is under 18. The place is safe to visit. Apparently there's not much to actually see other than the aftermath of a disaster that's persisted for over 60 years. That and the plumes of smoke that billow up around one of the town's cemeteries, and the ash that dances on in the air. Centralia's not quite a ghost town, not yet, but it certainly feels haunted. And I look and beheld a pale horse, and his name who sat upon him was Death, and hell followed with him. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you get a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links are in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, mi bamboo. Just over 2 years ago now, I got a call from an old friend's wife. I thought it'd be her and my old friend Luke passing on some belated Christmas wishes, as I hadn't seen either of them over the festive period. It marked the first time in almost 20 years that I hadn't seen him during that time, but for that, there was a very reasonable explanation. The week before Christmas, Luke's mom had suddenly passed away. He and his family were devastated, so instead of doing the usual and spending every spare moment down at the pub, he very understandably wanted to have a quiet Christmas. The funeral had been small, a family affair, and so when the name of Luke's wife popped up on my phone, I was excited to hear from her and my old friend. But as it turned out, Luke wasn't there, and in fact, he'd gone missing. Sarah said it wasn't so much Luke's absence that worried her. It was what he'd said before he left. He was still grieving, so the idea of him needing some time alone was understandable, but when Sarah said he mentioned something about talking to an angel, my jaw dropped. Sarah asked where he was going and why, and Luke only told her, "You wouldn't understand," or "You wouldn't believe me." Sarah then said she wouldn't let him leave until he told her where he was going, and when Luke replied, "To talk to an angel," she was too stunned to stop him as he shoved his way past her with a bag full of supplies and some spare clothes. When she asked if I knew what that meant, I said yes, that I did, and that while I couldn't promise anything, I had a pretty good idea where I could find him, and not only would I tell her where that was, I'd do one better. I'd drive all the way up to Scotland, and I'd bring Luke home myself. Sarah was worried Luke had gone insane, and while I didn't know if that was the case, I knew that if we got the police involved, Luke might end up getting into some serious trouble. Now, we didn't want him locked in a cell or doing 30 days in a mental health unit if all he needed was just a nice hug. And if he needed serious treatment, then sure, we could go down that road if we needed to. But both me and Sarah agreed that the best thing to do was to find him before he got himself into trouble. And not just the legal kind either. More like trouble from the weather. Sarah noticed how Luke was packing some camping gear into his car before he left. Another thing which frightened her, because where was he planning on camping in the middle of bloody winter? She had no idea, but I did. Like I said, Scotland. More than 20 years before, when myself, Luke, and two friends of ours were all either 21 and 22, we went on a camping trip to Ayrshire. We drove out to a place called Loch Braden, set up a campsite near the loch's edge, and then spent a few days roasting chestnuts on an open fire, getting pissed drunk and hoping it would snow. And yes, you heard that right. We didn't head out camping in the summertime like normal people. We went 2 days after Christmas because we felt cheated out of a white one and fancied an excuse to booze it up around a warm, crackling fire. Now, I know that probably sounds mental to some people who would rightly assume winter camping to be a pretty terrible idea, but we were young, dumb, and full of such terrible ideas. And so off we went. It didn't snow while we were there, But we did find a chestnut tree, and now the taste forever reminds me of freezing my balls off up in Scotland. It was worth it for the fire and booze and the banter though, and it wasn't just beer and vodka keeping our own fires burning, if you know what I mean. We were passing spliffs back and forth, but not Luke. Luke didn't do anything like that, so nothing but alcohol passed his lips. Or at least, it seemed that way, right up until the point he just sort of walked off. Now, me and our two friends were absolutely bombed, so while we were splitting our sides over absolute nonsense, Luke seemed to be on a different wavelength. I kept an eye on him to make sure that he was doing okay, and he didn't seem sad, but over time he got quieter and quieter until eventually he just got up and walked off on his own. We called out to him, asking where he was going, because we'd usually announce if we were going for a piss or whatever, for safety purposes, I suppose. But Luke didn't say anything, and we had to call out and ask where he was going, just to be told, just going for a walk. Now me and our two pals started poking fun at him and saying he was slinking off to take the knock, as we called it, which just means vomiting after drinking or smoking too much. Now I thought that he'd be back in a few minutes, but I think maybe an hour flew by with us just laughing away before we realized that Luke still hadn't come back. Now we started panicking a bit, because our mobiles were useless out there in the middle of nowhere, so off we went with our torches to go looking for Luke. Now it got quite scary at times, and not just because we were so drunk and stoned, but because reality started to become something of an elastic concept at times. That was mostly my fault, and that admission will make a lot more sense later. But for now, let me quickly reassure you by saying that we found Luke, safe and sound, and got him back to the campsite. Now, we were all knackered by then, and so not long after getting back to camp, we got into our sleeping bags and let the campfire burn down as we got some much-needed rest. But then, as we're all lying there in our tents and there's nothing but quiet and stillness, Luke spoke up in this obviously drunken voice and said something like, "Guys, I saw an angel out there." Now, he said it so sincerely that we all just sort of burst out laughing. One of our friends, Ben, replied asking, "Bloody hell, mate, how much you had to drink?" Now our other friend was laughing, saying, "You saw a Christmas angel, did you? My arse you did. The angel flew out of those lagers you were drinking." Now Luke insisted he wasn't mistaken, but sounded like he was on the verge of passing out, and then once the laughter died down, we all just sort of slowly fell asleep. Now the next day, we packed away the camping gear and agreed on a nice fried breakfast in a cafe before heading home. We poked a bit of fun at Luke over his claim that he'd seen an angel, but he took it on the chin with a very much, "Fine, you don't have to believe me" kind of attitude. Now I assumed Luke might feel a bit embarrassed and was all too willing to move on from his little sighting, but he didn't. In fact, over the next year or so, the angel sighting seemed to be the basis for Luke's newfound faith. He didn't turn into a complete Bible thumper or anything like that, and since he didn't shove it down our throats or anything, me and his other friends were just kind of like, whatever floats your boat, pal. Some came to believe that whenever Luke talked about the angel, he was weaving a kind of metaphor about finding God up in Scotland one Christmas after having a bit too much to drink. But I knew Luke wasn't talking in metaphors. He really did think that he'd seen an angel. And so when he told his wife that he was going to talk to one, I had a pretty good idea of where he was heading. And that place was Loch Braden, the same place that we'd gone camping all those years before. I rang into work, told them I needed a few days off of work for personal reasons, and then drove up to Ayrshire first thing in the morning. I then reached Loch Braden by about 1:30 in the afternoon, and there was snow at the time, not much of it, but enough to give it that proper desolate look. And I can't say it was enjoyable though, because strong winds meant that it was absolutely freezing, and I had to bundle up against the cold before heading out in search of Luke. I didn't wander around the loch calling out his name. Instead, I was laser guided towards the place we'd camped at all those years earlier, and when I found it, there stood a dark green tent with a dead campfire and a few bits of camping equipment sitting near the entrance. I called out to Luke asking, "Are you there, mate?" But the tent was empty. I had no way of knowing if the tent was really his, not until I found the Bible he had sitting next to a rolled-up sleeping bag, and then I knew. I then spent the next hour or so wandering around the snowy woods calling out Luke's name, but when I didn't find him, I wandered back to his camp and decided to wait for him there while I got a fire going to keep warm. It was almost dark by the time I heard footsteps approaching, and at first I was a bit nervous that it wouldn't be Luke. But it was, and since I already had a feeling that he wouldn't be pleased to see me, I wasn't surprised when he wasn't. No, I said something to him like, "Hey mate," and was about to offer an explanation as to why I was there, but Luke cut me off by asking who told me where he was. Now, I didn't want to get his back up by treating him like a kid. I wanted cooperation, so that's what I went with, and told him Sarah was worried about him. He didn't get angry or anything, not yet, because he knew we were just concerned about him, but Luke did let me know, and very firmly, that he wouldn't be leaving till he talked to his angel. I honestly couldn't tell if he had gone crackers or not, so I tried to test him in my own little way on little bits of info. I asked him how long he'd been there, what route he'd taken on the drive up, and what he'd said to Sarah before leaving. All his answers seemed kind of lucid, and he didn't mention any kind of wild conspiracy theories or anything delusional like that, and he didn't go off on any religious rants either. He said he didn't expect me, his wife, or anyone else to understand, but he needed to find his guardian angel because he needed to get a message to his mom. And when he said that last part, it felt almost like a punch to the gut. Or maybe that's the wrong way of describing it, but it was just such a sad but almost sort of relatable thing to want. Like I said earlier, Luke's mom had suddenly passed away, and he was understandably taking that very badly. But it wasn't a question of what he was doing being healthy or not, or if what was happening was something much more damaging. It was a question of what Luke was going to do when I told him the truth. We had a nice long chat about the camp trip that we went on, and then touched on how his mom's funeral had been. It was nice to reminisce, but seeing him grieving so deeply was very tough. But then as we continued talking over a campfire supper and the darkness fully crept in, we got talking about Luke's angel and what it may or may not have been. Again, he was weirdly reasonable about it and didn't expect anyone to understand. It was just something that he had to do so he could be at peace with his mom's passing. But then, I asked how he'd feel if I could guarantee he wouldn't find his angel again, because it was my fault he thought he'd seen one in the first place. Luke just sort of laughed, because the very idea that it was me that was responsible for him seeing his angel was laughable. But the only reason he didn't full-on belly laugh, at least in my opinion, was the look on my face when suggesting it. Because I wasn't joking. In fact, I was very serious. Because the reason Luke wandered off in a daze like he did, and the reason he believed that he saw an angel, was because I put a tiny bit of LSD in his alcohol when he went off for a piss. He was already drunk, and he was drinking some cheap piss, so he didn't pick up on the taste at first, and I thought it'd have a funnier effect on him, but I guess it didn't. And when he didn't come back when he thought he would, I felt very personally responsible. No one but me knew I brought any, and I was planning on telling him that what I'd done come bedtime or the next morning. But after we, or should I say I, almost lost Luke, I decided not to tell anyone what I'd done for fear of the backlash. And then as the years went by, I felt more and more guilty about what I'd done. So much so that when Luke's wife told me that he'd put himself in danger by camping up in Scotland in the middle of winter, I felt personally responsible. It might have only been a snort, but Luke laughed when I suggested I was responsible for his angel sighting. But when I mentioned the acid that I'd slipped into his beer, not even trace of amusement was visible in his face. He went full-on denial mode and argued that I was only saying that to get him to come home. Now, I suppose I should make it clear to anyone reading this that I wasn't just making it up, and I really did put drugs in my friend's drink. My defense at the time was that it wasn't much. Enough to get him loosey-goosey, but not full-on tripping. But that's no excuse, I know that, because that one stupid joke had altered Luke's whole reality. And although he completely refused to accept it at first, that didn't last long. I think the thing that really pushed him over the edge was when I started describing his symptoms back to him. I told him that although he was quiet, I was worried about him because I knew the dose that I'd given him would serve as a real mood enhancer. And I also knew that he'd walked away from the fire at first because it was too bright for him. First-time trips can be like that, especially if you don't know what's going on. And I added it was me who initiated the Luke's going to vomit joke, partly to try and distract from the fact that I'd dosed him. I told him whatever he'd seen out there, be it a trick of the light or a big bird of prey passing over the face of the moon, his imagination had taken hold of it and turned it into something it wasn't. I was halfway into explaining how I knew it couldn't have been some full-on hallucination because I'd given him such a low dosage when Luke just charged me. He didn't shout or scream, he just started attacking me in a complete frenzy, punching and kicking till I was on the ground and curled up in a ball shouting, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." I did try and defend myself at first, purely on instinct, I suppose. But as you can imagine, it was a complete mismatch in terms of how angry he was versus how sorry I was. And when he stopped kicking me, Luke dropped to his knees and kind of rolled me over. I thought he was going to start punching me in the face, but instead, his hands went for my throat, and he started to strangle me. I reached up to try and claw his fingers away from my neck, and then I tried grabbing his arms at the elbows to drag them away, but neither thing worked. And it was then that I had this horrible moment of realization that this was how I was going to die. Murdered up in Scotland by one of my oldest friends because I'd revealed his entire belief system was the result of nothing more than a prank. I don't think I deserved to die for something like that, but in the moment, I had a very dark sense of, I get it. I brought this on myself. I still tried to get his hands off of me, but all that rage in him, it was like it gave him super strength or something. And I think it was only the thoughts of the consequences that made him stop. And by that I mean if he thought he could have gotten away with killing me, I'm not sure Luke would have let go. But he did. And when he did, it was like taking my very first breath of life all over again. I've never known a lungful like that, but I could feel how puffy and hot my face was from how red it had turned. And all the I'm sorry's got replaced with thank yous, because it was clear he'd just spared my life. But Luke wasn't ready to let bygones be bygones, and after pacing back and forth for a minute straight, still in a rage, he told me to do one, meaning get lost. I remember wanting to ask him if he was sure we couldn't just talk it out, but I knew that'd be a waste of breath. I'd never seen him that angry before, and not that I deserved it, but I knew that there'd be no reasoning with him at this point. Luke saw me hesitating to leave and then came at me shouting to F off and making out like he was going to hit me, and so I did as he asked and left. I walked back to my car, feeling the aches from Luke's punches and kicks and the soreness in my throat, and then drove back home, and we never spoke since. I called his wife from a service station and filled her in on everything that had happened. I put off telling her about the spiking incident for as long as I could, but when I did, she did a kind of verbal double take in asking me to repeat myself, and when I did, she immediately hung up. There was no anger, no insults. She just hung up the phone, and that was the last time I spoke to her, too. I understand why they've chosen to cut me off. I just hope that one day they find it in their hearts to forgive me, and if Luke still has his faith after I told him, then I hope that'll one day be the case. Because after thinking about it for quite a while, and I think that in a way, Luke really did find his angel out there at that old Ayrshire campsite, and when it spoke to him and told him to spare my life, he listened. My name's Allison. I'm from Seattle, and while it took me way longer than I wanted to, I'm finally ready to send this over. For the longest time, I had a friend named Chris, and Chris suffered from persistent depressive disorder. It started after he lost his job, got violently mugged, and then got really sick with some kind of viral infection, all while his relationship with his fiancée was falling apart around him. He ended up moving back in with his parents up near Richmond Beach for a while, and then after finding it harder and harder to get out of bed and leave the house every day, Chris just sort of stopped trying. He was put on various cocktails of medication in the hopes one might work, but nothing did, and for a while he just rotted away indoors. But then in early spring of 2019, Chris asked if I wanted to go get sushi. He was online a lot, which was pretty much the only way we kept in touch, so hearing from him wasn't a shock. But hearing that he wanted to meet in person, that came as a real surprise. I accepted the invitation, and while he still had a whiff of hermit about him, he seemed way, way better than before. I didn't question it, I was just too happy to see progress, but at the same time I knew that there had to be something going on in Chris's life to prompt such an improvement in him. I'd be damned if I wasn't going to figure out what it was. The day after we met for sushi, I asked Chris what had changed, like if he'd been doing or taking something new. And he said he'd found a kind of support group that met once a week, and since he started going, he'd been feeling a lot better about life. They met in a coffee shop, but they didn't sit in a circle, doing land acknowledgments and using therapy language. It was more like show up, hang out, and just talk to people for real. And that was usually a little talk at the end by the group's organizer, but that consisted of nothing more than a poem and maybe the odd announcement. It was very informal, very laid back, and for the first time in a long time, Chris found the confidence to start living his life again. Now this was obviously great to hear, so I asked about it, and Chris said the group was called Mother's Love. It seems so crazy to me that after all the medication and all the therapy that Chris really just needed some connection, you know? I don't take it to heart that we as friends couldn't do that for him either, because Chris needed new connections with new people as concrete evidence that he could place faith in his fellow humans again. Sometimes I'd ask him about the group, and that's how I found out that they didn't have any kind of online presence because they didn't want a whole bunch of people turning up and killing the vibe. It was supposed to be intimate and meaningful, so it was down to attendees to exercise discretion in who they invited. I had to wait months until late December of that same year, 2019, to get anything resembling an invite. But when that invite came, it was not in the form I expected it to be. When Chris asked if I was still interested in getting involved, I told him I didn't know about involved, but I sure did want to stop by so I could check it out. And that's when he told me about the winter retreat. According to him, Mother's Love had reached a point where expansion was starting to make sense, so each current member had been instructed to pick out a +1 for a weekend of camping. And then to incentivize their attendance, the whole weekend of the retreat would be entirely free for that +1. And at first I wasn't sure because spending 2 nights in a tent together in the freezing cold did not sound like my idea of fun. But when Chris told me it'd be more like glamping, as in like super warm tents with super fancy features, I totally had to reconsider. He said the food would be all vegan, which was awesome, and that the open bar on Saturday night would be a really fun way of making new friends while getting lit for free. Well, that about sealed it for me, and I promptly prepared myself for a weekend of winter camping. We arrived at what amounted to a luxury campground on Friday afternoon, and it was totally amazing. They had showers, a bar that served hot food, and then a kind of conference and party room. And the tents? They were more like miniature cabins. They had covered floors, a heater, separate sleeping compartments, thank God to be honest, and a little communal space with squishy log pillows to sit on. We didn't just have super cozy, faux fur-lined sleeping bags either. We were giving these heavy, memory foam sleeping mattresses as well, and they were super squishy and soft. It was definitely not what sprang to mind when I thought free camping weekend, but I also remember wondering, who the hell put all the money up for this? And I definitely wasn't about to question it though, so I just sort of went with it. Now once we were all settled in, one of the retreat's organizers stopped by mine and Chris's tent and asked us to attend a little conference hall for the welcoming ceremony. We found about 30 people in the conference hall before Chris started introducing me to some of the people he knew. We chatted for a while, making introductions, and finally, an older lady took to the podium and asked for our attention. She introduced herself as Mary, and then after welcoming all the newcomers to Mother's Love, she touched on some topics that we'd be discussing over the next 48 hours or so. And only then did I realize that Chris hadn't told me the whole story. I don't want to rehash everything that Mary lady said because she talked for like 45 minutes, but most of it was about the seminars, and this is the gist of it. There was one about maintaining a low impact on the environment, which was all well and good, but then there was one about anti-natalism, which turned out to be a fancy word for thinking having babies is like wrong or something. And when I asked Chris about that afterwards, he said some people believe the earth is so overpopulated that it's messing up the environment. But I thought Chris's group was just coffee and pancakes, not hardcore political stuff. And Chris said it didn't start out that way. It was just something that they all got talking about over time. But there seemed to be a dramatic difference between the seminar on centering oneself in nature and the one I think was titled The Death March of Western Capitalism. Now, I thought we were going to be drinking cocoa around a campfire and going on nature walks, but Chris just kind of shrugged it off. He said he wasn't really into the political stuff either, so we could just sit it out if I wanted to and head off on that nature walk when I was excited to. And then I asked him about something Mary had said when she was introducing herself, and his response wasn't nearly so reassuring. And so when Mary, the organizer lady, introduced herself, she said a number in the 300s, and then ppm, and I'm thinking, huh? What? In my head, but she just breezed right past it without explaining. Chris said that Mary and a lot of the regulars didn't use numbers to describe their birth years. They used ppm, which, after double-checking it, definitely stands for parts per million, and then the number describes how much CO2 there was in the atmosphere during that year. And so, like when Mary said, I was born in 300 whatever ppm, she meant like the 50s or something. And I remember thinking, bro, what the heck? This is goofy as hell. Because, yeah, screw the oil companies, dude, sure, but using ppm instead of just saying your birth year, just a bunch of weirdos. But Chris didn't think it was all that funny. I mean, he smiled, but he didn't seem to think it was dumb like I did. And then I asked him if he knew what ppm he was born at. Then, without skipping a beat, he then says 352. He laughed at my reaction and said he didn't go around telling people like Mary and the others. It was just something he Googled one time out of interest and then happened to remember. And I remember feeling like I'd kind of let him down because I was definitely not going to be able to sit through a whole bunch of political seminars. But he said not to worry, that we'd just go to the ones that sounded interesting to me. And then we went over to dinner and got talking about some of the other campers. And that part was actually super fun. Like, I'm a really social butterfly, so getting to meet everyone was cool. Dinner was great too, and we had vegan Indian food and a few drinks, and then after more of that political talk from Mary, we all went back to our tents to enjoy our early night before an early start. Now, I won't bore you with everything we did that next day because it was a lot, but it was actually super chill until dinner that evening when we started to get hyped about the party with all the free booze. But before we went off to our tents again to get ready, Mary had an announcement to make. She said the next morning all the retreat's male attendees would be entitled to receive a gift, a blessing of Mother Nature in fact, and it was entirely free. Unfortunately, the same gift would not be bestowed on female attendees, but that was something that they were looking into, and anyone interested should approach an organizer with their queries. There was a lot of confused female faces, but also notice how not all the girls there looked confused. Some of them looked like they knew exactly why, and that should have been my first big clue right there. Well, heading back to the glamping tent to get ready for the party, I asked Chris what this free gift was all about. Chris said that he had to talk to me about something, but I asked if it could wait because by that point my curiosity was burning. But then Chris said it was that very same free gift he wanted to talk to me about, and so I'm thinking, okay, go on, and when he told me, I remember my jaw dropping, because Chris told me that free gift was a vasectomy. Now, I thought he was joking, and while Chris was smiling, it wasn't in a jokey way, more like in a this is good news kind of way. As it turns out, I had no idea this was the case till Chris went through it with me, but a vasectomy is actually a super simple procedure. Guys only need a local anesthetic, and then a trained professional can render a dude infertile with just a single needle-thin puncture to a guy's taint. It's not a major surgery, and while a guy definitely needs to rest up and avoid serious exercise or exertion, it's not like he's going to be held up in a hospital bed for a week like a woman after her hysterectomy. And so after I told Chris, "No way, dude. They can't do surgeries out here. That's impossible," he made it clear that not only was it very possible, but he was planning on getting the snip, as he called it, that very next morning. And I'm like, this is a joke, right? But Chris wasn't kidding. He said what brought him so much hope was the idea no one else would have to suffer like he did. His parents had brought him into the world against his will, without ever considering whether he might be happy or not. And that was a mistake he wasn't going to repeat. Knowing he wouldn't be able to reproduce made him feel like he was doing something to solve the problem, even if it was just one small but significant act. Now, I'm sure a lot of heartless psychos are going to read this and say, "Chris was making a choice about his body. How dare you try and prevent that?" Well, first off, go jump in a dumpster. And while you're in there, lying among the trash where you belong, consider that I wasn't objecting to him getting a piercing or getting frosted tips or whatever. I was objecting to him getting a mother-freaking vasectomy. Oh, but what's that I hear you cry? Oh, people from the trash, you can reverse a vasectomy. That is indeed true, but then riddle me this, dumpster dude. Does the reversal involve actual knock-you-out surgery and reopening the old vasectomy scar? Well, yes, it does. And is the surgery always successful? No, it's not. And while I didn't know that till I Googled it in a panic, I sure as heck showed it to Chris when I did. And if he didn't want to have kids, he could put a damned hood on it, or the 100 other not-safe-for-work things people do to make sure their humps don't mean bumps, as they say. But no, Chris had made his mind up. He wanted his little sacred rights so he could respect his mother's love, and there was nothing I could do to convince him otherwise. But on that, he was wrong. Rather than go into the whole drama of what happened when we were drunk, I'll just cut to the important part. We got plastered on all that free alcohol, and while I tried my very best to drop the whole vasectomy objection and just enjoy our time together, that obviously proved impossible. I got fixated on the idea the root of his motivation was destructive, not constructive, and that maybe he wasn't as mentally well as he thought he was. When we went somewhere quiet to talk, I told him how he had zero clue what was going to happen in the future, and how he might well live to regret his decision, especially if reversing the process failed and he was made infertile for good. Now he's drunk and says, "What's the point? What woman would ever want to have kids with me?" And so I told him lots of women would, maybe even myself, because, like I said, you never know how the future's going to unfold. Now, we didn't immediately start making out like in the movie or anything, but I thought I actually got through to him after saying how once he was done putting himself together and had a job and took care of himself, then he was attracted enough that plenty of girls would want to date him. And after that, we hugged it out, and he thanked me for not just being his plus one, but being a good friend and giving him hope. Now, I'll admit, that made me tear up and cry a little, but I was also super smashed, so there was that. We went back to the party, had a couple of more drinks to lift our spirits again, and then we went back to our tent and went to sleep, in our own separate sleeping compartments. Now, my memory of those last couple of hours is kind of hazy, I'll be honest, but what I do remember is going to sleep with the knowledge that one of my best friends was not about to do something potentially irreversible. But when I woke up the next morning, Chris wasn't in the tent. I put on a bunch of warm clothes and went looking for him, but was so hungover that I only got a few steps out of our glamping tent before I ran into a tree and started puking while leaning against it. Now after that, and once I sort of cleaned myself up, I went looking for Chris, but found the atmosphere in the camp to be way different than before. During the previous 2 days, whenever we went anywhere, everyone was saying, "Hey, how's it going?" to us, and were generally super friendly. But when I walked around the camp that morning, everyone just sort of stared at me in total silence. I mean, they whispered and talked among themselves as I passed, but they wouldn't say anything to me, and they wouldn't return my fake, panicking but pretending to be friendly smiles. Now, I kept asking, "Has anyone seen Chris?" But no one would answer me, and it took until I found one of the organizers before I got any kind of explanation. The conference room was being used as the surgery, and I could already see a couple of guys sitting in the little waiting area through a large window, but I couldn't see Chris. And that's when I was approached by that same girl who welcomed us on the first day and was asked to return to our tent so we could talk in private. On the way, I kept asking, "Did Chris get a vasectomy?" But she wouldn't tell me. Not until we got back to our tent when she confirmed it. Chris has gotten up that morning bright and early, and not only did he get the snip, but he was literally the first guy to get it done. He was actually resting in another tent as we spoke and was kept separate from me because of what a, quote, negative person I was being. Now, she was the first one who told me what a terrible person I was for not just being like, "Yeah, cool, no big deal, bud." And I said the same thing to her as I'd said to anyone else. "Go F yourself with a cactus, you psychos." Chris was a vulnerable, emotionally damaged person who needed serious psychiatric care. And then as his new friends, instead of encouraging him to get it, they tricked him into a physical solution to what was a mental problem. And personally, I'll never stop hating them for that. I'll also never stop hating them for how they let people treat me as I was leaving. I cannot overstate how sickening it was to attend a seminar on feminism in Trump's America one day, and then the next, have women just standing back and smiling as grown-ass men got up in my face and screamed the C word at me so furiously that I remember their spittle landing on my cheek. I actually thought that they were going to beat me up by the time they started shoving me and throwing rocks. They didn't give a crap that I was Chris's ride either. They said that they'd find a real friend to drive him home, and I should get the hell out of there while I still could. I was shaking by the time I got to my car with my stuff, and I was in tears by the time I had the keys in the ignition. I felt like I'd enabled one of my oldest friends to do something awful to himself, and then by the time I realized what was even happening, it was too late, and I'd done too little to stop it. Chris and I haven't spoken since. I've tried to reach out, but he doesn't want to now. I don't even care if he got a vasectomy anymore. I mean, it's his body, his choice, right? But I just wish he'd stop punishing me for trying to play the devil's advocate and convince him that a permanent solution to a temporary problem might not have been the way to go, and that weird cult that he joined is very, very weird. So Chris, if you're out there, call me. I miss you. My name is Alf. I'm a fan from Sweden, and today I would like to tell you my very own true scary story about the most frightening experience of my whole life. I joined the Army when I was 18, and I loved being a soldier. Well, when I was 23, I was diagnosed with a rare medical disorder and had to be discharged. I was devastated, and while I eventually adjusted to a new routine, I still miss being in the field very much. I ended up asking a couple of my old school friends if they'd like to go camping sometime, and while most thought that that was a great idea, they didn't so much enjoy the specifics of my idea. For obvious reasons, most camping here takes place in the summertime, but I didn't want to go in the summertime. I wanted to go in the freezing Swedish winter. Most people thought that I was crazy, and were saying, "Oh, thanks, friend, I'm out." Others said that they'd consider it and then dropped out one by one as the days ticked down to D-Day. In the end, the only person left who was dead set on joining me was an old friend of ours who'd moved to a different city, a friend named Varg. Varg wasn't really named Varg, it was his nickname he gave himself, meaning wolf, which should give you an instant idea of what he was like as a person. And well, despite it, I can safely tell you that he was even worse than you might imagine. If we hadn't been such close friends for so long, there's no way that I'd have tolerated behavior like Varg's. And honestly, I think him moving to Bergen for a girl that he met online actually saved our friendship, and he wasn't around to act like a jackwad anymore. He would drink and drive, get into big fights with his girlfriend, and post all about it on Facebook, and he was constantly getting fired from menial jobs for doing the stupidest things, like drinking openly on the job or sleeping on shift and then getting angry when his colleagues woke him up. And like I said, I definitely wouldn't have been friends with him had I met him yesterday, but for the most part, we actually got along quite well. We had a similar sense of humor, we both enjoyed the same sort of movies and music, and we both had a big passion for outdoor survival scenarios. And that's how I ended up thinking that just me and Varg, a winter camping trip might actually be a good time. But one of the real pros of camping in the winter was the lack of bears, which usually hibernate between late autumn and the very late spring. Now, I still insisted that we hang some bear bait somewhere away from the camp, but it didn't help, and even though we went camping in late February, we were unfortunate enough to be found by a bear who'd woken up too early and was desperate to find food. We woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of a huge brown bear sniffing around our camp, having eaten the bait and went looking for more. We rushed out of the tent, yelling and screaming at it in the darkness to scare it away. It appeared to work at first and the bear backed off, but then it sort of false charged and tricked me into stumbling backwards so awkwardly I actually sprained my ankle pretty badly. Thankfully, it was just a false charge, otherwise I'd have been in very serious trouble. But even though we managed to scare it off for good using the bear mace that we carried with us, we were almost out of food and my ankle was in a very sorry state. I took some painkillers and then we tried to fix up our campsite a little and salvage our food before heading back to our tent. We slept until dawn, not very well I should add, and then once it was light, Varg volunteered to find a shop somewhere so he could bring back food and some stronger painkillers. I thought that was very cool of him, like just the sort of behavior that kept me friends with him, and Varg can be a pain in the ass sometimes, but you could really rely on him when you really needed to. I stayed in the tent with my ankle raised and the bear mace at the ready, and then maybe 2.5 hours later, Varg reappeared with his pack full of stuff. Now I thought that he'd have more than some bread, bacon, and my painkillers, but when he emptied the bag inside our tent, he had all kinds of stuff with him. He had a few bottles of vodka, a whole carton of cigarettes, dozens of bars of chocolate, and a lot of elk jerky, or what we call renja snacks. Varg also had a ton of medication with him too, but not just painkillers. There were all kinds of things, from anti-allergy medicine to antacids for stomach trouble, and while I expected Varg to be pleased with himself at having brought back such a bounty, he seemed almost angry. He emptied out the bag with some force, like he was full of spite, and when I saw that strange variety of medicine tumble out onto the ground, I started to get kind of suspicious. I asked Varg where he'd gotten all that stuff, and he just said, "I found a shop." But then when I asked him why he bought and me anti-allergy medication, he snapped a little and said he just grabbed whatever he could because he needed to be fast. It made sense in a way. Varg wasn't a rich man and he wasn't generous or careless with his money, and so after a moment of thought I turned to him and asked, "Did you steal these things?" Now I knew the answer before he even said anything. He had that guilty look about him that I knew all too well, and in the past I sometimes found it funny, because you could always read his face when he'd be the one to do something wrong, like hide the teacher's chalk or put a pin on another people's chair. But that time, I didn't find it funny, and neither did Varg. He still had that angry air about him as he told me, "I didn't have enough money." And I found this outrageous, as any normal person would only buy what they could afford. But at any objection, Varg tried to defend himself by explaining what had happened. He said at first, all he did was put down the painkillers, the vodka, and the cigarettes, but he was short by just a couple of krona, our dollars here. And the lady tells him he needs more money, but Varg insisted it was an emergency and she needed to accept the amount he had. Obviously, the lady saw no emergency, just a man trying to buy vodka at like 8 in the morning, and so she told him no. Varg said he offered to come back later with the rest of the money, but sensing he probably wouldn't, the woman said no once again. And this is when Varg lost his mind. He attacked the lady, beat her till she wasn't moving anymore, and then filled his pack with anything he could grab before running out of the shop. He didn't even get help from me, he just ran before someone came along to see what he'd done. I was furious, but so was he, and if you can believe it, we argued back and forth about who was in the right. Varg insisted he did the right thing for me and him, and that was all that mattered, and to this day I still can't believe he saw things that way. And don't get me wrong, I appreciate his instinct to take care of an injured friend, but what he did to that woman was unforgivable, and we argued about it for quite a while until finally he announced that he was getting drunk. Varg couldn't go back to the little country shop that he'd found. the only one for miles around. He'd have to walk for miles and miles to some other place to get help. And the cold had completely killed our little flip phones, so we needed a landline, and then since we were way out in the middle of nowhere, Varg would have to search long and hard to find one he could use. So before that, he was going to get drunk. Now, if you imagine Varg planned on getting drunk and then getting back behind the wheel of my car, then yes, that's exactly what he's planning on doing, and this sparked another argument between us. But since it truly was a case of beggars not being able to be choosers, I had to shut my mouth, drink a little vodka to help the painkillers along, and wait until he was good and ready to help me. And there came a point when there was nothing but silence. I didn't have anything to say to him, and he didn't have anything to say to me. And then as we sat there, me eating and him smoking, I noticed a little plane flying in the sky above our heads. I didn't think much of it at first. Who would? It was just a small plane, but then, minutes later, I saw it fly over us again before it started circling us. Now, for the sake of nothing but my own amusement, I started waving at it with both arms as if to say, SOS, help us. I hoped it might fly straight and dip its wings or something, like a sign that it had seen us, but not a minute later, it flew away again without any kind of signal or indication. Varg kept on drinking and smoking for maybe 10 to 15 minutes, then finally stood up on very wobbly legs and said, "Okay, time to go." I remember groaning, not in pain, but at the thought of him being pulled over or worse, driving my car off the road and getting himself hurt. But as I looked up at him, I saw someone behind him walking towards us through the snowy trees, and he had what looked like a shotgun in his hands. Varg must have seen my expression because he turned around to check out what I was seeing, and then when he did, he yelled "run," and then started sprinting away as fast as he could. I saw the man stop and aim at us, so I tried my best to also run as I heard a single shot boom around the landscape. As per my army training, I instinctively threw myself to the ground, and then I remembered letting out a scream of pain as I felt it shoot through my ankle. I got up and tried to run again, but fell down again. I then tried crawling, but knew that I wasn't moving fast enough, and so I did the only thing I could think of, and rolled onto my back to face the man approaching us, and begged for my life. I knew who it was, or at least I knew why he was shooting at us. It had to be the husband or brother or son of the woman Varg had hurt, and I was right. It was her husband. He had the shotgun pointed right at me as I explained it wasn't me, that it was my friend and that I had nothing to do with it. I think the man knew this and recognized the fleeing Varg from the description he'd been given because he loaded his shotgun and fired a second time. He missed Varg completely, but I didn't know this at the time. And so in my mind, and because there was no screaming, Varg was stone dead, and I was next. I begged him over and over not to shoot me as he loaded a third shell into his shotgun, and then for just a moment, he pointed the barrel right at my face. I thought it was all over for me. I thought I was a dead man. But after I started to pray, something I hadn't done since I was a child, the man lowered the gun and then offered me a hand to help me to my feet. All I could say was, thank you, again and again. It was no platitude either, but rather it stemmed from the deepest sense of gratitude I've ever felt. The man then told me his name was Oscar, and that if I wanted to leave those woods alive, I was going to help the police find the man who had beaten his wife half to death. I told him that sounded like a good deal, and then he helped me back to his 4x4, and we drove over to his store to meet his wife, who was being treated by paramedics, and more importantly, the policeman waiting for me. I was only too happy to talk to them, partly to clear my name and partly to fulfill my promise to Oscar. I wanted to do the right thing, but I also firmly believed that if I didn't, he would find me and kill me. Varg ended up going to prison for 6 years for what he did, but I heard they let him out in 4. We haven't spoken since, and to be honest, I consider it good riddance. But there is a part of me that wonders if someday he may pay me a visit to ask why I was so willing to talk to the police about him. And without pointing too fine a point on it, if he does, he won't get to escape like he did from that woman's husband. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember to always jack your wad. My name is Cody Key, and I'm a Navajo Nation police officer working out of Northeast Arizona, and I think I got a story that you might be interested in. Now, a little background of what I do for a living. Now, being a res cop is different. Most small-town cops police a county-sized area, which on average is about the size of New York City, whereas the Navajo Nation cops are responsible for 27,000 square miles of red dirt, bluffs, and forest. Now that's roughly the same size as West Virginia, meaning a single officer can be responsible for patrolling 70 square miles or more, with no backup showing up for hours at a time. And then while you're patrolling, you have to be mindful of whether you're in Arizona, Utah, or New Mexico, because different statutes apply in different places. And that's just about all the power the states get in the reservation, but then when it comes to major crimes, you can expect the FBI to show up in their cool jackets and sunglasses to treat us like we're kids playing dress-up in their daddy's uniforms. Now one time, after I arrested this non-native guy for driving drunk, but then after checking with the state troopers, we found out that he was wanted for a whole bunch of other stuff. But then the process of transferring custody gets so complicated that in the end, my chief had me drive him out of the res and right to the state cops, like a freaking bounty hunter might do. That sort of layered sovereignty creates constant headaches for us, and it hurts to think that sometimes folks just straight up get away with stuff that they do on the reservation. It's not just all the red tape either, because we're chronically understaffed, so to get anything done, you gotta work longer than long hours. But that means fatigue and burnout, which is when mistakes get made, things get misfiled or misplaced, and an investigation you might have otherwise had a shot with, given the actual manpower, ends up on the cold case pile. Getting time off is nearly impossible. All the dust is hell on our gear and vehicles, and since our budgets are tied to federal grants, we tend not to get our hands on the gear that bigger departments take for granted. But for those of us that serve, it's not just a job, it's a calling. We get to protect our own people, on our own terms, and in conjunction with our ancient laws and customs too. We understand the families, the humor, and the history, and that builds trust in ways an outsider probably couldn't. We feel the impact directly because these are our communities, making that 50 grand a year in take-home pay sometimes feel like a bonus and not just a straight wage. We earn every penny of that bonus, though. Trust me when I say that, and just like every other kind of cop, we don't make it through our careers without working one or two cases that not only remain unsolved, but remain real head-scratchers even years and years later. And the story that I'm about to tell you is mine. Now one day, I get a call telling me to go perform a welfare check on a house in this little place called Wheatfields. Now the guy's name was Nakota Lopez, and it was his boss who called saying that since he hadn't shown up for 2 days in a row, he was worried about him. It took me almost an hour of driving through the heat and the dust to get there, and I had so much on my plate at the time that I remember thinking, please God, let it be a quick one. Well, I think God took issue with my request because in addition to not being a quick one, it turned out to be one of the most difficult, drawn-out, and downright disturbing cases of my career so far. There was no answer when I knocked on the door of this flat-roof bungalow surrounded by dusty scrub. There was a truck parked nearby, so I figured someone had to be home. And then when I got no answer, and since I couldn't get a look through any of the windows, I kicked the front door until the lock broke, and then pushed my way inside. But when I did, it was like walking into someone's nightmare. The first victim I noticed was sitting on the couch, eyes and mouth wide open like he was frozen in shock. His face was pale but spotless, whereas his torso and lap were soaked with blood that had no doubt come from the watermelon-sized hole in his chest. The wound was terrible, but it was the look on his face that really haunts me. The look of terror, like he couldn't understand what was killing him. Another victim lay dead near the home's back door, face down with their guts splayed out beside him. Now, it looked like he'd been crushed, like someone had dropped a heavy weight on him until he just sort of burst. While one of his arms was stretched out before him, fingers forming a kind of rigid claw from where the last thing he did was reach for the door handle, I think. And there was another victim across the room, that one missing his throat. But the fourth and final victim was the worst, because he looked like he had been shredded. There was blood everywhere, but whatever had been done to that fourth victim left spray and splatter all over the corner walls and ceiling. But what really pushed me over the edge was finding his face. A long, long way from where it should have been. That's what had me rushing outside and rushing as far from the house as I could before I emptied my stomach into the dirt. I'd seen dead bodies before, but I'd never seen anything like that before in my life, and never since either. Obviously, it was a shock to the system, but after getting my crap together, I called it in, and within a couple of hours the whole place was swarming with res cops and a couple of FBI agents. No one had seen anything like that in a long time, and I'm not just talking about the number of bodies. I'm talking about the way they'd been killed. We hadn't had a serious animal attack in coming up on 12 years by then. A couple of snake and spider bites here and there, sure, but nothing that resulted in any fatalities. From the state of the bodies, people figured a cougar or maybe a bear must have gotten inside, and they'd spooked it so bad that it just went crazy on them. Now, there were obvious teeth and claw marks on the bodies too, even tufts of fur at the scene, pulled out as someone tried to fight back. But right from the beginning, there were a number of inconsistencies. The first being, how the hell did the animal get inside, and where did it go? So when I arrived, both front and back doors were closed and locked, as were the windows, and there was no sign a blood-soaked animal had either climbed or crashed through any of them. Now, it sort of made sense that one of the victims was drunk and let whatever killed them inside, but unless said animal was capable of closing and locking the door after leaving, then something obviously wasn't adding up. But the inconsistencies didn't stop there. Aside from the whole locked doors issue, the first person to really call attention to how strange it all was the FBI forensics guy they brought in. He was this really nerdy guy named Brian, and he won't mind me saying this, by the way, but he was so obsessed with the injuries animals are capable of inflicting that it kind of verged on creepy. Seeing those dead bodies all torn up like they were, it had me running outside to puke. But Brian, he just sort of said, "Oh wow," like a vintage car guy seeing a Ferrari 250 GTO in the wild. He worked on the scene for 2 or 3 days, photographing and measuring everything while cataloging the parts that were missing. And then when he came back, he said that nothing seemed to make any sense. First off, the damage inflicted on the victims was inconsistent with that expected from an animal. If all 4 victims had been trapped in there with a freaked-out cougar, they'd be scratched up and bitten in all kinds of places. But aside from the 4th victim, who, like I said, had been almost eviscerated, the damage was as devastating as it seemed to be completely deliberate. Now, the guy on the couch had his heart torn out, and the other, his throat ripped open. The one by the door looked like he'd been pounced on while running for it, but then it seemed like whatever caught him was either huge and landed on him so heavy it burst him open, or it stomped on him, almost like a deer might. But no deer could inflict that kind of damage, at least not with just a couple of strikes. And while some other kind of animal could be trained to attack a certain part of someone's body, there were no human footprints in the area that would indicate the presence of a trainer or owner. And then while we're on the subject of footprints, the next thing that Brian had to tell us sounded even weirder. So after searching the area surrounding the house, Brian and his team figured that they'd found their culprit. They found tracks leading to and from the house that sort of appeared to have been made by some black bear, and he used the word appeared very deliberately because, in his humble opinion, it wasn't a black bear that left the tracks. Now, I'm no expert, so don't crucify me if I don't explain this right, because when Brian explained it, he might as well have been speaking Chinese. And so after he explained what was so weird about the tracks to the chief and me, and in the presence of those two FBI agents, all four of us were looking at him like, huh? So he broke it down Barney style. Basically, things that walk on all fours leave a certain kind of foot or paw print compared to human beings, because moving around on four legs distributes force among the limbs differently. So generally speaking, things that walk on two legs leave deeper footprints because each step has more weight to it. Now, bears can walk on their hind legs, and for surprisingly long distances too in some cases, but they're not naturally bipedal. And yet for some reason, the distance between steps, along with the depth of the paw prints, suggested a huge black bear had walked up to the house on its hind legs, gained entry to kill everyone inside, and then seemingly walked off on its hind legs too. Now, the former isn't exactly impossible. Take it from me, weirder things have happened on the res, but the chances of the bear continuing to walk away after a full meal was very tiny. But then it hadn't eaten a full meal, not by a long shot, and that was another thing that made exactly zero sense to Brian from forensics, because from what he could tell, our bear hadn't eaten anything but one victim's heart. Brian said it was the only thing he could say for certain was missing from the scene. But only a bear that was desperately hungry would approach a human home so brazenly, and regardless of how it gained entry, there's no way in hell that it would have eaten nothing but one guy's heart before leaving. Brian was an expert on animal attacks. He'd seen literally hundreds of them, and what he saw inside and surrounding that house and wheat fields was, quote, like nothing he'd ever laid eyes on. These were his words, not mine. Now, for a while, the working theory was that in so many words, someone had used a trained black bear as a murder weapon. I mean, there was literally nothing else for us to go on. Not until the results of the DNA tests came back, which would give us an idea of who was actually there at the time of the murders. Now, this was way back in the 1990s when DNA stuff was still basically brand new, so we had to wait weeks before the lab results came back. We weren't excited for them too, but when they came, they just made the case even more confusing. The tufts of fur found at the scene were identified as belonging to a black bear, so obviously they weren't sent away for testing. And among the human blood samples taken from the scene, the lab managed to identify 4 distinct sets of DNA belonging to each of the 4 victims. But among the hair samples taken, and I'm talking like random hairs picked up off the ground in some cases, a 5th variety of human DNA was found. Now, this obviously caused a lot of excitement at first because it meant they potentially had a sample of the killer's DNA. But when they tried to analyze it, the process didn't work. Again, I'm not a scientist, so don't chew my butt out in the comments telling me how wrong I am, but from what I understand, they have to make lots and lots of copies of a DNA sample in order to actually analyze it. Now, I guess it's kind of like beer. You can't judge how good a beer is on one alone. You gotta drink 8 to really appreciate the flavor. Am I right, gentlemen? But then, to make a bunch of copies, you gotta work some white man magic on it in the lab, and that's where the problem came in. Because no matter how many times the scientists used their medicine on it, they couldn't make copies of this fifth DNA sample. Now, this isn't unheard of, they said, but when it happens, scientists can usually at least say why it happens. But in the case of that mysterious sample, they couldn't figure it out, no matter how hard they tried. That was probably the most frustrating moment of the whole investigation, when we seemed to have the killer right there in front of us, but we just couldn't make him out. But it was around that time that we got word from off the reservation, saying how 3 of our 4 victims had been suspects in a serious assault that took place the year before. All 3 had been arrested in Flagstaff after a waitress had reported being carnally assaulted after her shift ended one night. I read the report myself, and what happened to that poor girl was rough. But since there wasn't enough evidence to bring it to trial, all 3 of these guys ended up walking after spending only a week or 2 in the county jail. And since all 3 were killed in this one not-so-random animal attack, suspicion fell on the family of the girl who had been assaulted, a Navajo family who just so happened to live on the reservation themselves. I made the trip over there with the chief myself, and the second the dad walked out of his house when we pulled up, we could tell that he'd heard about what happened, because he was smiling, ear to ear. We asked if we could talk, and he told us to either arrest him or get off of his property, and then that was that. We got back into my truck and drove all the way back to the sheriff's office, knowing that there was a hell of a good chance that the girl's family had been involved in the murders. But how was something we were never able to figure out. Now, I'm sure I probably don't need to tell you this because we never did find anyone with a highly trained killer bear that walked everywhere on 2 legs, and we never managed to match the DNA sample to anyone because all the remaining samples were thrown out for fear of contaminants. We kept on working it for a while, hoping something might come up, but in the end, we were diverted to other cases, and the Wheatfields murders ended up on the cold pile. The department moved on for the most part, but every so often we'd reopen the file, read through the details, and wonder what the hell happened that night. So my grandfather, Bill, lived one hell of a life. He grew up in the early 1900s in a poor family from Oklahoma City, so even at a young age, he was put to work so he could bolster the family income. So he was a pin setter at a bowling alley for a while, and then he worked as a crow scarer before a brief spell as a mudlark. Now the first is exactly what it sounds like, but the latter was when people would scour muddy riverbanks for valuables, kind of like those New York City dirt divers who go digging for treasure in the Diamond District. By the time he was a teenager, he'd already worked on the railroads as a lamplighter and a rat catcher's assistant, believe it or not. And then he worked his way from an ice cutter to an elevator operator to a cigar factory worker. And those were hard times back then, and changing times too, so a man had to change with it. But at the same time, he always needs bread in his belly and a place to lay his head, so my grandfather Bill started looking for an industry that wouldn't bottom out on him when he least expected it. He needed an industry that was never going to go away no matter how much society changed. So he turned to bounty hunting. He didn't need any kind of license or training. All he needed to do was find a bail bondsman and then talk them into hiring him. But that, as it turned out, was much easier said than done. He knew how to shoot a shotgun and a pistol all right, and he'd watched his pa bring down a whitetail or 2 when he was a boy, so he knew all the basics of tracking and hunting. But hunting an animal is a heck of a lot different than hunting a man, and Grandpa Bill hadn't even pointed a weapon at another person, let alone pulled the trigger. So unfortunately, hiring him wasn't exactly an attractive prospect for most outfits, and so Grandpa went west. He bought a horse and rode into Texas and then stopped at Armadillo to see if anyone would hire him. They told him to keep on going into New Mexico and that once he got to Albuquerque, he was sure to find someone desperate enough to hire him. And while those Texas bounty hunters weren't exactly polite, they weren't wrong. Grandpa Bill found no work in Tucumcari and no work in Santa Fe either, but he hadn't even been in Albuquerque for a full day before he heard about a bondsman named Broke-Nosed Jack McNally, who was hiring with no experience necessary. Grandpa asked where he could find this broke-nosed fella, but almost everyone he asked advised him against it. Broke-Nosed Jack only hired those with no experience, so he could use them as cannon fodder or in whatever harebrained misadventure he had planned. Grandpa took their advice and kept on looking for bondsmen who had both a good reputation and a willingness to hire without prior experience. But as you can imagine, that wasn't easy. Grandpa was almost 22 by the time he arrived in Albuquerque, but apparently he didn't look a day over 16. Even big-shot bondsmen he spoke to would offer him fatherly advice, like how he should bring up some experience in the army or as a deputy sheriff. That, or they'd just laugh him out of the saloon while telling him to go back to Okie. But Grandpa hadn't traveled all the way to Albuquerque to become some dog-faced doughboy, nor had he gone there for a deputy's wages or to turn around and return home a failure. But after a few days of begging and pilfering to feed himself, a storekeep caught him stealing and demanded restitution. It looked like Grandpa Bill was doomed to spend the next 4 months in the county jail, but as the store keeps going wild and yelling out for the sheriff, or a deputy, or anybody to come throw Grandpa in jail, who steps up to pay for the can of beans he stole? None other than Broke-Nosed Jack. Grandpa said he thought Jack had only paid for his meals so he'd be indebted to him, but it turns out Jack had no such intention. He had, however, heard Grandpa had been looking for bounty work and wanted to know why he hadn't come to him first. Grandpa relayed all he'd been told about Broke-Nosed Jack being a slippery son of a bitch, but Jack just laughed. He said that he'd lost a couple of hires on bounty hunts before, but so had just about everyone else. The reason people talked crap about him so much was because he had a way of getting the biggest bounties before everyone else. That, and his father had fought for the Union back when he was a boy. Grandpa Bill complained that no one would hire him without experience, and asked how the hell he was supposed to get any at all if no one will give him a shot. Broke-Nosed Jack told him that's why he hired without experience, and that people either had it or they didn't. Well, Grandpa got hired on the spot, with Jack promising that they could ride down a relatively easy bounty together, just so he could get some experience. Everything people said about Broke-Nosed Jack turned out to be bunk, as in spite of his raggedy appearance and advanced age, he treated Grandpa like he would his own son. And then after sneaking up on the camp of a drunk who had been causing trouble at one of the saloons, they took him captive without a shot being fired, and that was Grandpa's first bounty boxed off with nothing but a short night ride. Now he could have moved on, I guess, and found himself a more professional outfit run by someone younger and faster on the draw, but I guess Broke-Nosed Jack treated him so well, in the face of all rumors to the contrary, that Grandpa believed he was the only one he could trust. They rode together on a couple more breadwinners, as Jack called them. Smaller jobs that had tied them over until a bigger one came along. But then, after a few weeks of merely surviving on what little money was coming in, Jack announced that he had something big lined up. Real big. Now, it was so hot off the presses, as it were, that the Albuquerque sheriff hadn't even put up any bounty posters yet. But since he and Broke-Nose went way, way back, Jack got the tip before anyone else did. And that was how he stayed one step ahead of the other bondsmen and bounty hunters. Not through any nefarious means, but through knowing the right people. But even if word of the court-ordered bounty did reach the ears of Albuquerque's bondsmen, Broke-Nose still wouldn't have faced fierce competition, and all on account of who the bounty was. For the past few years, word had been filtering down from Colorado about a group of bandits led by a man named Slim Sosi. Slim wasn't his real name, it's just the English for that Navajo word Sosi, which in turn was a little more than an alias he used. Slim and his boys used to rob trains, trucks, and travelers. They even hit general stores or banks when they were desperate enough. Slim himself would never show up at any of the robberies. His boys did all the dirty work for him, but you always knew when it was them that had done it because of the terror and bloodshed they always left in their wake. And they didn't just kill indiscriminately, they threw their own lives away too. They'd do things like ride with a vanguard whose sole purpose was to tie down the cops while they burned and looted. It didn't seem to matter if half of them were doomed. They rode anyway, like the only thing that was important was getting Slim Sosi his money. There were a couple of bounties over in Colorado with his name on them, but no one who went after him and his gang ever came back. The price on his head just kept on rising, and folks kept on gathering up posses and going after him. But if they did come back, they came back bleeding, and never with the same number of guys they went out with. The Sosi gang was seemingly unstoppable, at least until they tried robbing a bank said to have a vault full of cash and gold. Because when they showed up, they found nothing but an ambush waiting for them. Slim Sosi must have sent pretty much every man he had at that bank, because word is about 30 to 40 riders showed up, all wearing masks and shooting their guns in the air. But a bunch of federal agents were lying in wait atop nearby buildings, and when the Sosi boys were least expecting it, they opened up on them. It was a massacre, and since only a handful of the riders were smart enough to turn tail and run, the streets of that little Colorado town ran red with their blood. The feds chased them all the way up into the hills near the Arizona state line, but lost them among the hills, trees, and caves of what by then was the Ute Reservation. The feds kept on searching for a while, but found no one. Then come late spring of that next year, and there's a robbery in this little town called Twin Lakes in northwestern New Mexico. Only one person survived it by playing dead after he'd been shot, but he was quite certain that the man who shot him looked more like some kind of medicine man than any kind of bandit. And based on that description alone, the Albuquerque sheriff was sure, as eggs is eggs, that it was Slim Sosi they were describing. Putting a bounty on him at full strength would mean sending men to their deaths, but in a weakened state, a team of savvy bounty hunters just might be able to bring him in, dead or alive. The price on his head wasn't as big as it had been up in Colorado, but split 3 or 4 ways, it would be enough to live comfortably on for about 6 months to a year. And that was just the kind of money Grandpa Bill was looking to make. So instead of suggesting that maybe the Sosi gang was a bigger mouthful than they could chew, he helped Broke-Nosed Jack recruit a third man, and then they rode for the hills and towards certain death. First came the reconnaissance, as Grandpa Bill, Broke-Nosed Jack, and a man named Marcus Washington rode from village to village asking local Navajo where they figured that the Sosi gang might be held up. In all but one case, they suggested a hill overlooking Bull Canyon. There were caves up there, lots of them, and while one side gave them the cover of dense forest, the other side looked over the canyon and acted as a kind of lookout post for anyone approaching. Broke-Nosed Jack figured that their only chance was to sneak up on the cave using the trees as cover, but to get there, the 3 of them would have to ride a whole day before they reached a suitable spot to make camp. They had to stay as quiet and invisible as possible, so there were no fires that night, just hard ground and the fear of what awaited them the next morning. But before the sun had even risen on the first day's hunt, disaster struck. While the 3 men were trying to sleep, Grandpa Bill said he woke up to the sound of something rushing through the darkness towards them. But by the time anyone had even flicked on their flashlight, a large Mexican gray wolf pounced on Marcus Washington and began savaging him. Broke-Nosed Jack fired 2 careful shots, and although both missed, he managed to scare the wolf off, but the damage had been done. Marcus survived his injuries, but his leg had been near shredded below the knee, and so after sterilizing it as best he could with some whiskey-soaked bandages, Jack put the wounded man back on his horse and then sent it back towards civilization. Grandpa Bill figured the previous night's shots might have alerted the Sosi gang, if they were actually in the area, but no one had come down the hillside firing at them through the trees, so either they weren't there to begin with, or they were too weak to even respond to a little gunfire. In which case, Jack decided that they should press on. They didn't encounter a single other person on the way up that hill, which, from what I understand, was steep as hell in places and thick with pine trees. But not long after sunrise, that wolf attacked them for a second time. Grandpa Bill said the wolf moved too fast for him to land a shot on it, and besides, his hands were shaking too bad to shoot straight. But he watched with his own two eyes as Broke-Nosed Jack hit that big old wolf not once, but twice, before it ran off again. Grandpa said that he thought for sure that thing was finished, as two clear shots hit through its torso were bound to finish it off eventually. But not long after, it came for them again. Grandpa said it was huge, bigger than any dog he'd ever seen, and with a head the size of a damn engine block. And then when it came running across the hillside at them again, looking mad as hell with its fur soaked in its own blood, it looked demonic. Broke-Nosed Jack and Grandpa opened up on it again, and for a second time that day, a couple of Jack's shots landed in places that should have brought that wolf down. Yet it stayed on its feet, carried on charging, and would have taken old Broke-Nose's head off had he not darted behind a tree. Grandpa said that was the only time one of his bullets hit the mark, when that huge Mexican gray skidded in the dirt, yelping wildly as it was struck by both him and Broke-Nosed Jack. The wolf limped off as fast as it could, leaving Jack and Grandpa reloading their weapons as fast as they could. They expected another mad charge from the wolf that wouldn't die, but it was never seen again. Jack and Grandpa finally made their way to the top of the hill, where a patch of flatland overlooking the canyon lay near the mouth of some shallow cave. There was a blood trail leading to it, so both men figured that they'd find the dead wolf laying inside, but instead, they found Slim Sosi, lying naked on a top of bloody wolf skin, breathing his last breaths. He'd been shot full of holes, so many it was amazing he was still alive. And then as he looked up at my grandpa with wide, desperate eyes, Broke-Nosed Jack put him out of his misery. They had no idea who shot him or where they'd gone after, but it didn't matter. Slim Sosi, the most wanted man in 3 states, was there for the taking. And so Jack cut off his head to bring back to Albuquerque, and then off they went to find their horses again. On the ride back, with Slim Sosi's head in a black canvas bag bouncing on the back of Jack's horse, he and Grandpa tried to figure out what they'd just experienced. Now, it wasn't just finding Slim like that which didn't make sense. It was the behavior of that gray wolf. Wolves had been hunted to near extinction in the area by the late 20s, so whenever one did bump into a person out in the sticks, they either watched from a cautious distance or ran off terrified. To have one straight-up attack like that was almost unheard of, but to have it attack over and over without any sight or sound of any pups anywhere, it didn't make a single shred of sense. Slim could have been caught up in another firefight someplace else, and maybe his boys brought him back to this cave so he could die in peace. That all made at least some kind of sense. But the way that wolf acted was one of the most unsettling and downright frightening things either man has ever faced. They claimed the bounty, and after making sure the injured Marcus Washington got his share, they lived well off of that money for quite some time. But that was the last bounty hunt my Grandpa Bill ever went on, and he used his share of the money to move on to bigger and better things. But what he experienced up in those forests of the Navajo Nation taught him 2 valuable lessons: that some things defy any kind of rational explanation, and that others are better off forgotten. My name is Tom Yazzie, and I'm 78 years old now, so most people around here call me Grandpa Tom, and I live out near the Chuska Mountains here on the Navajo Nation. Now, my life is pretty steady these days. I get up early, drink my coffee outside if the weather's nice enough, and then keep busy by working on stuff around the house or heading over to my daughter's place to see my grandkids. Now, I live much like any other older gentleman in America, I guess, just with one big difference. I'm an elder, and as many of you may know, that means that I have an important role to play in my community. When it comes down to it, I'd say that my role is about 50% giving advice and 50% just listening to people. And it's not just spiritual stuff either. People ask me to give them home improvement advice, dating advice, all kinds of different stuff. But sometimes they just want to vent, too. About their jobs, about their kids on social media, you name it. I know I go to chapter meetings when they need elders there, and I still help with ceremonies when I'm asked. It's not flashy, it's mostly just showing up and remembering how things were done before. But remembering things is important, and the way we often remember things around here is through telling stories. It's those stories that make us who we are, and at my age, I've become a kind of walking library of them. I figure that's my job now, holding on to them so they don't fade away and become forgotten. But out of all of them, there's one that I still turn over in my mind sometimes on the darker, quieter nights when the wind picks up and sleep doesn't come easy. It's not one of the big creation stories or hero tales, and while it involves plain old regular people, it's not altogether a regular story either. It's a mystery, maybe the greatest I'll ever personally know of, but let me warn you beforehand, it won't make a single lick of sense to you, because it sure as heck doesn't to me. One night, we get a call saying a girl named Nasha hadn't come home after playing in the woods with her friends. The girl was only 9 at the time, so obviously still a very vulnerable person at that age. So myself, a handful of reservation officers, and a whole bunch of volunteers spent all night wandering the woods, calling out Nasha's name. By the time dawn broke, we still hadn't found the girl. So, understandably, people were starting to get either very worried or pretty hopeless. They still searched, but some folks said that they believed Nasha was dead. And so later that morning, when little Nasha showed up at her parents' place without a stitch of clothing on her, people were overjoyed to see her with breath still in her lungs. But that joy didn't last long, because when Nasha explained what had happened to her, everyone who heard the story was horrified. Like I said, little Nasha had been playing with her friends out in the woods, not too far from her home, when she became separated for some reason. She tried to find her friends again, but soon realized that there was a man following her through the trees. Police asked her to describe what the man looked like, but Nasha couldn't. All she said was that he appeared as a sort of dark shape, moving behind her from tree to tree. Then, as he got closer and closer, she got frightened and started to run. The man chased her, and he was faster too. So in order to get away from him, Nasha squeezed herself into the hollow of some tree and crouched down so the man wouldn't be able to grab her. But after, she couldn't remember a thing. Sadly, in considering what condition she showed up in, this was most likely due to the fact that her attempts to evade the man hadn't been successful. Yet following a medical exam, we discovered the extent of her injuries was nothing short of baffling. On the surface, the abuse that poor girl had been subjected to was extreme in nature. First off, the girl's teeth were cracked, each and every one of them, and secondly, all her fingers and toenails appeared to have been removed. Now this offered a suggestion that the girl had been tortured by the man who chased her and caught her. But then, after that medical exam, we found out some strangely good news. To our relief, the doctors declared that there was no indication that Nasha had been violated in any shape or form. This was obviously welcomed by all involved, but the nature of Nasha's injuries still had us all scratching our heads, wondering. For example, while the girl's teeth were cracked, there was no corresponding injuries to her face, mouth, or gums. And it was like whoever caught her had, and with exceptional care, taken a small hammer to each one of them while Nasha had been rendered unconscious. The damage to her finger and toenails didn't seem to add up either. If they'd been torn out via torture, then there'd have been damage to the surrounding tissue, but there wasn't. In fact, the doctors said it appeared as if some kind of onychomedesis had taken place, which is basically the nail bed had deliberately and harmlessly separated itself from the nail. Now, it grew back all right. It took a while, but they did. But that then raised the question of, what the hell happened to this girl to make her body react in such a strange way? Now, one explanation was that she'd suffered some kind of allergic reaction, but blood tests showed no indication that that was the case. And it didn't stop there either. Doctors found extensive bruising on Nasha's limbs and torso, which supported the theory that she'd been violently beaten by whoever caught her in the woods that evening. But after her medical exam, doctors found the bruises weren't the result of blunt force trauma, but severe muscle tears which caused tiny blood vessels within the tissue to break and leak blood. But then what caused these injuries, if not severe beating? Well, when the doctors came back with an answer, we felt no closer to the truth than we were before, because they told us in no uncertain terms that it was like little Nasha had been tortured by being stretched. Kind of like what you would have found in the old school Spanish Inquisition style, as in tied to a rack before having their arms and legs pulled in opposite directions. Now, all in all, it appeared as if Nasha's captor had subjected her to very nightmarish forms of torture. It's just that none of it made any sense. Why crack her teeth in such an elaborate way? And what had he used to make her nails fall out the way they did? It looked like her tormentor had also done something to her eyes, as in the coming days, Nasha developed some kind of infection. But following a visit to a reservation clinic, the mystery only deepened. The doctor there, after performing a couple of tests, declared that Nasha had what's called dacryocystitis, which is when a person's tear ducts become blocked and causes an infection. Now, at first we figured this was because the man who caught her had put something in Nasha's eyes, maybe to blind her so she wouldn't be able to identify him or fight back, but the doctor disagreed. Now, grown-ups can get blocked tear ducts, but usually as a result of trauma. Side effects from medication or just the natural progression of age. The tear ducts narrow as a person gets older. But none of these were relevant to Nasha, who hadn't suffered any facial or nasal trauma. It wasn't on any medications, and like I said, was only 9 years old at the time of this incident. However, what the doctor did say was that blocked tear ducts are very common among newborn babies, and to her, Nasha's eye infection was extremely similar to those suffered by newborns. It wasn't something had been sprayed in her eyes, it was like her tear ducts were brand new, and therefore susceptible to all those associated infections and diseases. Now, as you can probably tell, Nasha's condition caused a lot of concern and confusion, but the priority of the reservation cops was to find the man who'd hurt her and bring him to justice. But that issue was a bridge too far, as they say, because while Nasha eventually made a full recovery, the police were unable to track down her attacker, and as far as we know, the man still walks among us on the reservation, free to inflict another terrifying assault on an innocent young woman. And that's a scary thought, right? Just as scary then as it is now. And so out of pure desperation, I went for a walk around the area that she'd been attacked, in hopes of finding something, really anything, to help push the investigation along. I walked the area in question all morning, trying to figure out exactly where Nasha had been playing and where she'd gone after getting separated. I found the area where they'd been playing no problem because with a tracker's eye, it looked like the forest floor had been all churned up and disturbed from where they'd been playing together. I used that spot as the center of my little search, and then from there, I went walking in these big circles in hopes of finding that tree that Nasha had taken shelter in. Now, about 2 hours in, I found a set of small human tracks that appeared to have been made by someone running at full speed. But while I had no doubt that they belonged to Nasha, there were no larger tracks indicating that she'd been followed by anyone. That alone seemed strange to me, but what actually shocked me was when I found the tree that Nasha seemed to have hidden inside. Because unless I was looking at the wrong one, only something the size of a small coyote or fox would have been able to fit inside of it. Now, convinced that I'd misfollowed the directions I'd been given, and doubly convinced that I was at the wrong tree, I went looking all over for the right one. But I walked for miles and miles around the woods that morning, and I didn't find a single other tree that matched the description I'd been given. And in the end, the only thing that made sense was that Nasha had misremembered the events leading up to her attack, which, considering how patchy her memory was, didn't require a leap of faith to believe. We waited to see if the reservation cops could locate the man who'd attacked Nasha, and with a lot of hope, too, since they seemed like the only thing that'd A, bring her to justice, and B, unravel the whole mystery of what had happened to her and why. But sadly, and much to the frustration of myself and my fellow elders, our police officers were unable to track him down and arrest him, which, like I said, is something that still causes me a great deal of concern even all these years later. Now, I could end the story here, I guess. It's frightening and mysterious enough for me to pass it on, but I guess it's not altogether complete unless I mention a conversation that I had about a year after with another elder over a few cups of coffee. We were talking about the incident with Nasha, and thankfully by that stage she'd fully recovered and was back to her regular happy self again. Now, I talked about it with this sort of we dodged a bullet attitude because realistically, things could have been so much worse for that poor girl. She went through hell, all right, but she made it through alive and without the trauma of being violated, and all before she was even old enough to know what that meant. But the elder I was talking to, he didn't seem to share that same sense of relief I did. I asked him why the whole incident still unsettled him so much, wondering if it was the perp going uncaught or something deeper that was bothering him. And as it turned out, it fell very much into that something deeper column. He said it was something he'd been thinking about after I'd mentioned the hollow to him, and how it looked too small for even a girl like Nasha to climb into. He mentioned that in passing to another elder, a much older man, and when he did, the older of the two seemed terrified. He said he knew of some similar incident that occurred many years prior, one which had almost all the exact same details. Girl goes missing, shows up again with strange wounds and no memory of what happened. Everyone was just glad to have her back for a while and treated her like a victim. At least until she made her family victims too, when she set their trailer on fire in the middle of the night. Now, neighbors came out to put out the fire once they realized what was happening, and at first they thought that that little girl was hopping around in a panic while screaming in terror. But she wasn't. She was dancing. And those weren't screams either. She was laughing, both maniacally and in a voice that was no longer her own. She was changing right before their eyes, and then when she saw her horrified neighbors approaching her, the girl dropped to all fours and went bounding off through the trees before vanishing from sight. Now, a few people went after the girl, but most stayed to put the fire out. And then by dawn, the fire was out, but the girl was nowhere to be found. And that's when people started to talk. Not everyone, because the subject is an extremely taboo one in our culture. So taboo that a lot of people still insist that the girl died in that fire. But those that had seen it happen and chose not to become part of the lie said the girl changed shape right before their eyes. They might not have used the Navajo word for it because just speaking it is thought to bring misfortune, but they may have used the English translation so as not to offend our ancestors, and that English version is skinwalker. I guess the literal translation would be something more like that which has the means to go on all fours. And while people talk about them more and more these days, it's still such a strange and taboo topic that we don't actually know all that much about them. They're not like vampires or werewolves with clearly defined rules on what they can and can't do. And as far as I know, sometimes each skinwalker can be different. But there's two things I know for sure, and that's how not only are skinwalkers evil by nature, but they derive their power from acts of evil, particularly those which result in pain, bloodshed, and death. And so to the elder I spoke to, what happened to little Nasha was no mystery. The thing that chased her through the woods was no man, but a thing of otherworldly evil that caught her, infected her, and most importantly, changed her. Her injuries weren't the result of a beating. They left behind a powerful and horrifying kind of metamorphosis, which turned her from a person into something else. It all made a sick kind of sense in a way. Her cracked teeth, the muscle tears, the infection that only newborn babies seem to get. But I try to draw a line between tradition and modernity, and to me, what my fellow elder was describing was a physical impossibility. I respect our traditions, I always have and I always will. They're everything to me. But at the same time, I can't bring myself to believe what certain people say about skinwalkers. I believe the fire wasn't an accident, and then maybe the girl's reaction was caused by the trauma of what she'd been through. But I don't believe that she transformed into some animal, and I don't believe little Nasha did either. And no matter how taboo some people find the idea, to me, the alternative is just far worse. I believe there's someone who gets their kicks inflicting strange and vile tortures on innocent young girls. Someone in our community, too. And that same community is so in denial about it that some choose to believe in old fairy tales rather than look at what, to me, is a clear and present danger. And it's only a matter of time before it strikes again. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m., and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over to my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links are down in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, I miss the Hamburglar.